Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first meeting of Subcommittee of Water Resources and Environment for the 116th Congress. I call this meeting to order. Today's hearing focuses on the tremendous clean water infrastructure needs facing our country and on the challenges facing our communities, large and small, urban, rural, and tribal, as well as American families in addressing the needs. It is a privilege to serve as the chairwoman of the subcommittee, and I am pleased to be joined by my colleague and ranking member, Mr. Westerman, of Hot Springs, Arkansas. We had a nice meeting, very comfortable meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I look forward to his input and working with him this Congress.
Thank you.
I also welcome new members to the subcommittee. Representative Debbie Mercosel Powell of Florida, Representative Salud Carvajal of California, Adriano Espaillat of New York, Representative Lizzie Fletcher of Texas, Representative Abby Finkenauer of Iowa, Rep. Antonio Delgado of New York, Representative Chris Papas of New Hampshire, Representative Angie Craig of Minnesota, Representative Harley Ruda of California, Representative Stephen Lynch of Massachusetts, Representative Tom Malinowski of New Jersey, Representative Gary Palmer of Alabama, and Representative Jennifer Gonzalez Colon of Puerto Rico. Welcome, everybody. This subcommittee will have a very busy agenda in the coming Congress, and I pledge to do my very best to run the committee in fairness, with mutual respect for every member, consistent with longstanding bipartisan success of the committee. We have an ambitious agenda, but achievable for this Congress. We will seek to find a legislative mechanism to ensure that all collections for Harbor Maintenance Fund are spent annually. We will hold hearings on WRDA 2018 implementation and lay the groundwork for enactment of new WRDA bill in 2020. As part of these discussions, we will look at ways to make our communities more resilient by learning about how we can use natural infrastructure, water recycling, and other tools. And I ask everybody to please provide comments, input so we can work on new WRDA and have it be more effective. We will strive to enact a bipartisan water infrastructure financing bill that not only authorizes the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, SRF, but also seeks to assure and address the affordability challenges facing all of our communities. Finally, we will renew our constitutional obligation to exercise congressional oversight over implementation of laws within our subcommittee's jurisdiction. We will start with now the opening of the hearing. To the topic of this hearing, the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, how federal infrastructure investment can help communities modernize water infrastructure and address affordability challenges. Today, our nation's network of sewers, stormwater conveyances, treatment facilities, they're all aging, often outdated, and in many places not meeting the standards and the needs of our communities or water quality needs. The American Society of Civil Engineers recently gave America's wastewater infrastructure the grade of a D+, up from a D, in its 2017 infrastructure report card. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, communities report a need of almost $300 billion of investment over the next 20 years to bring their wastewater treatment plants to a state of good repair. Yet these statistics only tell half of the story. As noted by our witnesses here today, many communities also face challenge of ensuring that water and sewer utilities remain affordable to those living in those communities. In communities of all sizes, as they seek to continually improve the quality, safety, and reliability of their water utilities, they often struggle to also address challenges of declining rate bases, lower income households, and other competing local needs. All of these factors, and many more, compel us to find ways to make sure the water quality improvements make them more affordable to our communities. Congress has already taken significant steps to meet this challenge through enactment of integrated planning legislation, thank you, and the promotion of nature-based or green infrastructure alternatives to address planning local water quality challenges, we have provided tools to communities to develop the more cost-effective long-term plans to meet local water challenges. We also need to make sure that we look at low-income communities and how they can be part of this too. More needs to be done. We have to find ways to make sure the cost of federal financing is affordable for all communities. One significant step that is long overdue is to reauthorize the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, a goal that has eluded Congress for almost 30 years. At witnesses note, this program is universal and very important to provide affordable financing to urban and rural communities alike, and its successes are typically limited only by lack of available resources. On Tuesday, I was pleased to join Chairman DeFazio, Congressman Don Young, Congressman John Katko in introducing H.R. 1497, the Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act, to reauthorize Clean Water SRF, State Revolving Fund. And I urge all of our members to support this legislation, our effort to address the local water quality challenges. I ask unanimous consent to include this in the record. So ordered. However, anybody have any objections? So ordered. However, for those communities where a state revolving loan is not enough to address local affordability needs, we need to ensure other tools are available. We need to fund targeted clean water grants, such as those authorized for combined and sanitary sewer overflows and stormwater capture and reuse in Water 2018 Water Resources Development Act. We also need to explore whether the federal government can play a role in helping subsidize the cost of clean water at household level, such as LIHEAP, as we do today for household heating and cooling costs through the low-income energy assistance program. It's a mouthful, LIHEAP. Many states and communities run similar rate assistance programs today, but I believe the federal government can take a greater role to reduce the cost of water to our American families, and I hope to discuss this issue further. Before us, we have a distinguished panel of witnesses that can talk about real-world examples of where our network of clean water infrastructure works, where it does not, and what we can do better. I urge all of our members to pay attention, listen to the stories, and to reflect on the real challenges American families face every day in obtaining clean, safe, affordable water and wastewater services. At this time, I'm pleased to yield to my colleague, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Westerman, for any thoughts he may have.
Thank you, Chairwoman Napolitano. It's an honor to get to serve with you, to be on the leadership side of the Republican side of the dais, but I look forward to working with you for good solutions that are good for America. You know, a lot of times there's a lot to be said in a name, and I think Chairwoman Napolitano couldn't have a better first name than Grace. I've always said that the definition of grace is getting something good that you don't deserve, and she exemplifies that. She's very kind, very nice to work with. Doesn't mean she's not tough and principled, but I appreciate the kindness and the openness to work together, and I look forward to carrying that relationship forward as we address these important issues. I'm happy that we have such a diverse panel here so that we can gain your perspective on the issues facing local communities and addressing the nation's water and wastewater infrastructure needs. These needs are substantial and they continue to grow. In many communities, including communities in my state and my district, water and wastewater infrastructure is long past its design life and in need of urgent repair, replacement, and upgrading. As a result, we see leaks and blockages that are all too common across the nation and represent a massive waste of a vital and sometimes scarce resource. Additionally, the needs are especially urgent for hundreds of communities trying to remedy the problem of combined sewer overflows, or CSOs, and sanitary sewer overflows, or SSOs, shrinking municipal budgets, insufficient independent financing capabilities, and increasingly burdensome regulations without the necessary federal support have strained communities' efforts to address these critical needs. This is especially the case for many of our small and rural communities. According to EPA, the total documented needs for sustainable wastewater infrastructure, CSO and SSO correction, and stormwater management are over $270 billion over the next 20 years. The needs for drinking water infrastructure drive this figure to over $600 billion, and these are considered conservative estimates. In Arkansas alone, the total documented needs are approaching $1 billion. So with talk of major infrastructure package, today we need to ask the not-so-simple questions. What can we do? How can we, and I don't necessarily mean the federal government, collectively, how can we pay for it? I believe it is going to take an all-hands-on-deck approach to reverse the decline of our nation's water infrastructure. Federal, state, and local investment will be necessary, but cannot be relied upon to solve all of our problems. Instead, we need to move away from business as usual and utilize every tool that's available. This means searching for new sources of funding, increasing collaboration between the public and private sectors, and improving federal regulations. We need smarter asset management and increased efficiencies in our water systems. And to achieve that, we need to incentivize the adoption of new and innovative technologies that will cut costs and improve water quality. In addition, communities, particularly those that are struggling to address their needs and reduce the financial burdens on households, need to be given greater flexibility, including through the implementation of a vibrant, integrated planning and permitting approach in addressing the compliance mandates that have been imposed upon them. Last year, the legislation that codified the EPA's Integrated Planning Initiative was enacted. EPA now needs to effectively implement the initiative to help communities meet their needs in a more cost-effective manner. We need to carefully prioritize our investments in water infrastructure to ensure that we are adequately protecting the public health, promoting the economic growth of our communities, and preventing the degradation of the environment. I look forward to hearing the thoughts of our witnesses today. And again, Chairwoman, it's an honor to be here in our first hearing. Having an engineering background and reading the testimony, it's kind of exciting to us nerds in the world. So I look forward to getting the hearing started, and I yield back.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for your kind words. It is a pleasure to have him working with us. It really, truly is in a bipartisan manner. I ask unanimous consent that the following submissions be made part of today's hearing record. A statement from Chairman of the committee, Peter DeFazio. A statement from Honorable Terry Sewell from Alabama. A letter dated March 5th, 2019 from the Western Governors Association. A statement from the American Society of Civil Engineers. Are there any objections? If not, so ordered. Thank you. We will now proceed to hear from our witnesses who will testify. Thank you for being here and welcome to our house and your house. We have the Honorable David Condon, Mayor, City of Spokane, Washington. And Mr. John Mosinski, the Water and Sewer Superintendent from the town of Greenport, New York. He will be introduced by Mr. Delgado. Ms. Katherine Flowers with Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. Ms. Maureen Taylor with Michigan Welfare Rights Organization, Detroit, Michigan. Mr. Andrew Cricon from the Camden County, New Jersey, Municipal Utilities Authority. And Professor Joe Heeps from the Vermont Law School. Your prepared statements will be entered in the record. All witnesses are asked to limit their remarks to 5 minutes. Mr. Delgado, would you like to introduce Mr. Mosinski?
I sure would. Thank you, Chairwoman. I appreciate the opportunity. It is my great honor to introduce one of the witnesses on today's panel, Mr. John Mosinski. John grew up in Athens, New York, and attended St. Pat's High School. He now lives in Stottville with his wife of 37 years, Dawn, and their 3 sons. John earned a degree in biology from SUNY Oswego, and after beginning his career in California, returned to New York to run a small water treatment plant in Valatia. John then began to work as a senior operator for the town of Greenport in 1998. In 2000, he became the superintendent of the water and wastewater department for the town of Greenport. His role as superintendent has made him a leader on rural water infrastructure needs. John has worked to diligently repair and replace broken water lines, as well as to oversee the construction of a new sewage treatment plant in the town. John has played an important role in dealing with the wastewater collection after flooding events caused by severe storms. After a hurricane in 2014, town of Greenport experienced sewage water backing overflowing into homes. John was responsible for overseeing the inspection, drainage, and repair of the overloaded pipes. The town of Greenport has seen no overflow issues since the project was completed in 2015. John is also responsible for the creation of a reimbursement program the town employed to get backflow preventers installed in individual residences. Through this program, residents were reimbursed up to $3,000. The town of Greenport will be looking to replace 14,000 feet of pipe starting in June, and John will be leading that project. I look forward to hearing his testimony today, and I'm excited to get to work with the Committee on Ways to help address the rural water infrastructure needs of the communities like that of Greenport. Thank you, Chairwoman.
Thank you, Mr. Delgado. Mr. Condon, you may proceed.
Well, good morning, and I'd like to thank the Chairwoman Napolitano and Ranking Member Westerman and the members of the committee for me to speak today. My name is David Condon. I'm the mayor of the city of Spokane, and I'm also representing the U.S. Conference of Mayors. I have served on the Mayor's Water Council for the last 7 years as part of the conference, and have served with many of our other local leaders, many from California and across the country, and really explaining why this infrastructure is so critical. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, especially to address 1497 and really look to the future of infrastructure in wastewater. Cities need the federal infrastructure investment in stormwater and wastewater projects. We need flexibility in meeting the regulatory requirements, and we need support for the innovation for affordable challenges or addressing the affordable challenges when delivering clean water projects. Last year, you said it, and we want to thank you for passing the integrated planning legislation, H.R. 7279. You know, it really took that leadership of this committee to make sure that integrated planning is a key component to the futures of the water infrastructure. It is so critical to Spokane's story. You know, I want to tell you a little bit about Spokane. I was elected in part because of water rates, went up 16% in a single year in my city. What happens in the fall? People get their bills from August and July. Because of those double-digit increases, from the primary to the general, there was a double-digit swing in the vote count, which led to my election. So when I took office, I took that lesson with me. I came here to Washington, D.C., and met with EPA officials in about this month of my first year, March. EPA officials told me you should ask for a consent decree and blame it on the federal government. They also said at the time they were thinking about a new approach, integrated planning, and that I should look to our region to look at it. So we took that approach. We saved our citizens some $150 million and at the same time got better pollution reduction results for our river. You can see, if you have our handout, that our city is around a beautiful Spokane River. Still, Spokane citizens are investing some $350 million to improve the health of that river. We are investing in some 24 tanks, which hold about 16 million gallons. We also are putting in some of the top-tier technology in our treatment plant, some which treats about 34 million gallons a year. We're using a membrane technology that is commonly used in drinking water solutions. We also have a commitment to remove stormwater flows from our system as we build our streets and have complete streets looking at all sorts of integrated solutions you can see on the back side of your handout on slide 2. You know, it really comes down to this, and I'll spend some time on this. It really talks about aligning our work with our citizens and our country's environmental goals. It's talking about making sure that we're accountable and finally affordable. So yes, we are aligned with our citizens' environmental goals and integration across our city. You can see on pictures 3, 4, and 5 that our integrated solutions have resulted in playfields, new plaza overlooking our river, and improved gateways to our city on top of those CSO tanks, never thought of before. We also must be accountable. Yes, accountable to regulations, but also accountable to make sure that we deliver on the permits. Finally, affordability. This investment, the largest of ever for our city, is some $4,000 per household on this alone. But we are committed to our rate increases not being any more than inflation, about 2.9%. And so, as you can see in Figure 1, like across this country, our community went through the ALICE assessment, asset limited, income constrained, but employed. For our community, that's some $59,000 for a family of 4. but our median household income, $46,500. You can see on the line for housing, some $789 is allocated to rent or housing costs. Take out of that a couple $100 for utilities, that leaves $500 for a family of four to find an apartment. Even in Spokane, that doesn't buy you much. So we need reasonable approaches and flexibility to meet the Clean Water Act. I finish with this. One, I want to thank you for the additional authorization in this bill, but we clearly need to work with the appropriations to make that come true. Number two, I want to reiterate, and it's wonderful to hear it, that all parties, federal, state, and local, must work together to look at our priorities and make sure that the financial burden doesn't fall onto our citizens. Number three, we really need to think outside the box and into innovation. We need to find a funding source to support integrated projects. Right now, we are forced to piecemeal together from many different funding sources, and if time permits in questioning, I'd love to talk about one that we're facing right now. And finally, number four, federal funding programs like your reauthorizing SRF are an amazing opportunity, and we need to continue to look at the opportunity for forgivable or lower percentage payback on those. I want to finish. Speaker Foley would have turned 90 years old yesterday. I sat and spoke to his wife last night for a couple hours at her home here. At that time, he had secured for our community some $100 million for a grant to remove septic systems from our community. We'd had an innovative local plan that did that to make the quality of our water that much better. But that was a grant from the federal government. So we believe the opportunity comes today to look back at that time and to make an investment in our environment like Speaker Foley did and this Congress has through the years. And we believe that this opportunity is a partnership with the federal, state, and local governments. Thank you, Chairwoman.
Thank you, Mr. Condon. Next is Mr. John Mosiski. You're on, sir.
Good morning, Chairwoman Napolitano and members of the committee. All small and rural communities in all of the states are very appreciative for the invitation to testify today about small community wastewater issues, the Clean Water Act, and water infrastructure financing. I am John Hiskey. I am the water superintendent for the town of Greenport. It's a small municipality in rural New York on the Hudson River, located in the 19th Congressional District. We have a population of just over 4,000 people and an annual budget of $5.3 million, which includes the operating budgets for both the town's water and sewer utilities. I want to thank our representative, Congressman Delgado, for his continued attention and help to all the municipalities in New York's 19th District with environmental protection and economic development. I would also like to thank you, Chairwoman Napolitano and Representatives Young and Keiko, for introducing the Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act of 2019 today. Your legislation is very welcome, especially the provisions to increase funding for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. My community, and many just like it, would not be operating today without the water infrastructure assistance from the state revolving funds. I am testifying today on behalf of all the approximately 12,000 small and rural communities in all states that operate public wastewater utilities through my affiliation with the National Rural Water Association and the New York Rural Water Association. About 85% of the approximately 15,000 public wastewater utilities in the U.S. are in small or rural communities. We have a much more challenging time complying with our Federal Clean Water Act permits and operating complex wastewater treatment systems due to the lack of technical resources in small communities. While the cost of a small community's water infrastructure may only be a fraction of a larger metropolitan community, the cost per household is often much higher because we have so few ratepayers to spread out the cost. Currently, our town is under a Clean Water Act enforcement order and struggling to pay for the needed sewer improvements. Our initial sewer system was installed in the 1930s with clay sewer pipe. This pipe cracks easily, which allows rainwater to flow into the collection system. Back in 2007, we were under a Clean Water Act consent order for violating our sewer permit. Every time we experienced a heavy rain, all the extra water overwhelmed the treatment plant and resulted in rainwater and sewage discharging to the Claverack Creek, which drains to the Hudson River. Fixing this situation was estimated to cost the town upwards of $10 million to build a new and larger treatment plant. This occurred around the same time that Congress passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. We received a $9.5 million funding package, which was half for loan forgiveness and half zero-interest loan, which we are still repaying. The newer sewer plant allowed us to comply with our consent order. However, we still had all the clay pipes in the ground, draining all the excess water during heavy rain events. For our drinking water utility, we need to replace the antiquated cast iron water lines that were installed in the 1930s. These lines are frequently breaking, causing civic and economic disruption. Before we started to replace the cast iron pipes in 2006, we were experiencing up to 50 line breaks a year, which is affecting just about everyone in our community. Over the past 15 years, we've replaced about 40% of our old cast iron lines with $5.8 million in financing. In 2014, we were pressured to sign another Clean Water Act enforcement order for sanitary sewer overflows. The failing clay sewer pipes were not overwhelming the sewer plant anymore, but it was causing the sewage water to back up into people's homes. We have taken a number of steps to comply with our current consent order, and so far we have prevented any reoccurrence of the sewage backups into anyone's home. However, we are still operating under the consent order, which may require the lining of additional sections of our faulty clay sewer pipes. It is likely to cost another $4.5 million, and most of the community currently thinks they are maxed out on their ability to pay. Raising rates at this time could actually threaten the political stability of the community. As the committee considers modifications to the SRFs, we urge you to target the federal funding within the SRFs to the communities and citizens most in need of the federal subsidies. This evaluation should be made on a per capita analysis that is sensitive to local economic conditions. In closing, I would like to thank this committee, which is very important to rural and small town America. Every federal dollar that has been granted to the many thousands of small towns to build, expand, and maintain their wastewater infrastructure through the state revolving funds was authorized by this committee. We are grateful to be able to testify today and grateful for the numerous opportunities this committee has provided rural America to testify and be included in the crafting of federal water environmental legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Ms. Flowers.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Napolitano, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, Ranking Member Westerman, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify. My name is Katherine Flowers. I'm the Rural Development Manager for the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. I'm also a practitioner in residence at the Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke University and a senior fellow at the Center for Earth Ethics and the founder of the Alabama Center for Rural Enterprise. I grew up in Lowndes County, Alabama, which is located along the route from Selma to Montgomery. As a child in the 1960s and 70s, I used an outhouse and a slop jar before my family eventually installed indoor plumbing. I left the area to achieve an education, and upon returning to Alabama in 2000, I was surprised at the disparities that still existed in rural wastewater treatment. Since 2002, I visited homes with wastewater failures at all levels. I first began meeting with people about this problem in the early 2000s as a pastor, a pregnant woman, and other members of the community were being threatened with or actually arrested for not being able to afford on-site wastewater treatment. Yes, it is a crime in this country if you could not afford wastewater treatment. Many of the community members have resorted to unpermitted alternate methods like straight piping to discharge raw sewage from their homes or disconnecting failing septic systems to keep the sewage from coming back into their homes. And while the arrests have decreased, the threat remains. I have visited homes with on-site systems that fail each time it rains and the sewage comes back into the homes either through the toilet, bathtub, or both. In one town, citizens pay a wastewater treatment fee, yet they still have sewage backing up into their homes and yards. Our neighborhood is bordered by a sewage lagoon, a cheap solution generally used in poor rural communities. In addition to the stench from the lagoon, their tanks must be pumped as often as 3 times a week to remove sewage from their yards or their homes. Children are unable to play in their yards due to raw sewage on the ground. This is not what people expect to see in the United States. In 2009, I was bitten by mosquitoes swarming a pool of raw sewage. My body broke out in a rash that doctors could not identify. I later reached out to Dr. Peter Hotez of the National School of Tropical Medicine in Texas, which culminated in a peer-reviewed study that was published in 2017. This study found that over 30% of Lowndes County residents tested were found to have hookworm and other tropical parasites long thought to have been eradicated in the United States. Inadequate wastewater is not just a Lowndes County or an Alabama problem. Inadequate wastewater treatment. It is estimated that more than 20% of the country uses on-site wastewater treatment, reaching 40% or more in areas in large rural populations. Up to half of the septic systems in the U.S. don't work properly or fail at some point. By some estimates, 60% of the land in the U.S. cannot support septic systems. It is time for Congress to act to address this widespread problem, beginning with acknowledging the problem more broadly, gathering more information, especially through the census, and eliminating policies that criminalize residents for being unable to afford wastewater treatment. In addition, I invite all of you to visit Lowndes County so you can witness the problem firsthand, but also talk to your own rural constituents, because some of these same problems are in all rural areas. Congress should further use its oversight powers to ensure that investments in addressing this problem are meaningful. Specifically, it is critical that funding should take into account the realities of climate change, community input, and the unique geography of an area. Funding must also go to those who need it most and cannot afford wastewater treatment or upgrades without assistance. And finally, if federal funding is used to continue to design and permit failing systems, the state entities that approve these systems should be held accountable instead of the individual homeowners. The Clean Water State Revolving Fund is an excellent tool to help communities with much needed wastewater upgrades, but to truly be effective, it needs the flexibility to reach the people who need it the most. Rural communities should no longer be left behind. Congress must begin addressing this problem now while also looking at technological solutions for the new future of wastewater. If we can treat wastewater in outer space, it is not unrealistic to see a time when one can go to a hardware store and purchase an on-site wastewater treatment system. This is an opportunity to remove the shame associated with discussing wastewater treatment failures and instead focus on sustainable solutions that provide meaningful investment. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Next, we have Ms. Maureen Taylor. You're on.
Good morning, Chairwoman Napolitano and members of the committee. My name is Maureen Taylor, and I bring you greetings from Michigan Welfare Rights, where I'm honored to serve as the state chairperson of that organization. And I want to say at the outset, we're so pleased that we were included in an opportunity to address these issues relative to how to manage water and water problems. Epic changes in the relationship between working people and the world over and traditional means of survival have altered the progress of humanity permanently. Since the age of industrialization, blue-collar America has only known one process of existence. You work, you earn a paycheck, you spend it on those things you need to continue to live. You run out of money, so you go back to work. This is the cycle that repeats itself. Cities like Cincinnati, Chicago, Gary, Flint, Highland Park, Pontiac, Detroit, and others have all similar histories which have been tied to these locations and industries that require mass numbers of laborers. Detroit and nearby communities built cars for the world, and that world was connected to automobile manufacturing and all of the ancillary items required to keep that industry thriving. In 1914, when Henry Ford advertised the first $5 a day opportunity for those willing to work on the assembly line, blue-collar workers, especially those in unions, established a pattern for the nation to follow: 8-hour days, extra pay on weekends, holiday pay, time off for vacations, health care benefits, academic benefits, etc. Municipal, school, and most other employees duplicated contracts that mirrored employee-employer relationships and negotiations set in factories. The quality of life for millions of us have been tied to those relationships from 1914 to 1984, just over 70 years. Standard of living for working people started to change in small, imperceptible ways in the mid-1980s that was coupled with population declines forced by massive losses of high-paying jobs. With the onset of high-tech manufacturing methods, the die was cast, and Detroit went from 1.9 million residents to just over 700,000 a day, today. With the population on the move, why keep so many schools open? Why keep hospitals open? Why keep opportunities available for people that will never find a job again? 2014, the Detroit Water Department started the most recent and egregious campaign of mass water shutoffs that targeted only low-income residential customers who were 2 months behind in payments or $150 in arrears. In June of that year, we started to hear rumors about something happening in a place called Flint, Michigan. Poisonings were going on, and the word started to come out. In the end of the program, both of these issues marked the genesis of long nights of terror for blue-collar workers, a night that has not yet ended. Despite multiple levels and battles to stop these draconian practices, residents have not been able to stop the moral bankruptcy of water shutoffs or even water poisonings. We are left to create methods of survival as the only option for Detroit, for Highland Park, for Flint, and for other cities and communities across the country who are facing shutoffs. In early 2014, the initial numbers shared with us that were being targeted for mass water shutoffs was 59,990 addresses. Since those days, Detroit has seen upwards of 100,000 disconnections. Possible solutions include these suggestions: a federally mandated opportunity to establish uniform policies on water and sewage affordability based on each residential customer's ability to pay. A federal dedicated source of funding to the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, and a renewal of the Build American Bonds program to address aging water and sewage infrastructure issues. In the end, in Detroit especially, the only thing I can say is that I don't live in a bankrupt city. I live in a city that has been bankrupted. We need you to help us to stop water shutoffs. We need you to help us restore all water services and then determine individual eligibility. And then we need you to help create a private and a public water policy and procedure. In the end, I want to thank you so very much for the opportunity to share a little bit about the misery that we've been going through. And I'm going to go further. I would like it if some of you that are here today might consider assigning someone from your offices to work directly with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your testimony. Next, Mr. Andrew Cricon. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Chairman Napolitano, Ranking Member Westerman, and distinguished members of the House Water, Resources, and Environment Subcommittee, I would like to sincerely thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today to discuss how the Camden County MUA in Camden, New Jersey, use the State Revolving Fund to significantly improve our wastewater infrastructure while holding our rates steady without impacting our communities. I work with the Camden County MUA, a city right across from Philadelphia, and I also serve as the board of directors of the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, and I work as the chair of their Utility of the Future and Environmental Justice and Community Service Committee. Camden County has used the State Revolving Fund to significantly improve our performance. And we also did that while holding rates. So specifically, by using the State Revolving Fund, we've borrowed over $1 billion from the fund since 1987 in today's dollars. In 1996, our household rate was $337 per year, 23 years ago. Today, 23 years later, by using the SRF to upgrade our system, our rate is only $352 per year per household. It's only gone up 4% in 23 years, less than 0.2% per year because of the State Revolving Fund. In that, with those funds, in Camden City, we have a combined sewer system too, and we have some of the same issues that Ms. Flowers described with regard to combined sewage backing up into people's homes, into parks, into streets. And your zip code should not define whether or not you have safe drinking water or whether or not you have sewage backing up into your streets, parks, or homes. But with the SRF, thanks to the SRF, we're going to be able to eliminate combined sewage flooding in Camden City for up to the 1-inch storm by the end of 2020. By the end of next year, that combined sewage flooding will be a thing of the past in Camden City because of the SRF, and we will not have to raise rates. Because the way the SRF works, it's a low-interest program, as you know. It's not a handout, it's a hand up. We're borrowing funds, it's a loan that we have to pay back, but because of the low interest rates, and because it's spread over 20 and now 30 years in New Jersey, we're able to take those funds, upgrade our system, and do it without affecting our economic distressed communities. Camden City is one of the poorest cities in the country. We have a household income of $26,000 per household. We have an unemployment rate of 10%. And yet, so for us, we can't raise the rates. Wastewater utilities like ours have to choose between infrastructure improvements and affordability for our communities. But with the state revolving fund, we don't have to choose. We can upgrade our facilities, and we can also do it in an affordable way. Like I said, our rate has only gone up 4% total in 23 years because all of our capital improvements are through the state revolving fund. The other thing that we're going to be doing is making our city more resilient. Hurricane Sandy was a disaster for the state of New Jersey. We want to make sure that it's not that we're not vulnerable to another storm like that. Using the state revolving fund, we're going to be, by the end of next year also, the same time frame, we will be generating all of our own electricity from our biosolids and taking Camden City's treatment plant off the grid and then building a microgrid to protect the drinking water plant, hospitals, fire, school, police, all through the state revolving fund without raising rates. Again, it's a loan program. It's not a grant, but it makes a huge difference. It is a hand up, not a handout. I can't stress that enough. So proposed solutions, to this infrastructure gap. Chairman Napolitano, you indicated that the American Society of Civil Engineers gave a D+ grade. That's terrible. It's not acceptable, for this country, for anyone, urban or rural. Everyone deserves safe drinking water and deserves to have freedom of sewage in their homes, in their streets. So the first thing we water utilities have to do is optimize. I heard what you said, Mr. Ranking Member Westerman, about we utilities have to do our work ourselves. So we are working to optimize our internal efficiencies. We public sector entities have to harness the private sector model of efficiency for the public good, and then use the state revolving fund to build our infrastructure in the most cost-effective way. Those two pillars have enabled us to upgrade our facilities without raising rates. And this can be replicated in any community across the country, urban or rural, because the state revolving fund is that successful, that terrific. The other thing, too, I do recommend, I agree, an affordability program is necessary. We need to make sure that our low-income customers are able to afford their services. Everyone deserves safe drinking water and freedom from sewage, combined sewage, ought to be a right that every American citizen has. And with the state revolving fund, it can be done. The other thing I really strongly recommend is a peer-to-peer effort. One of the things we found in Camden City is that although the state revolving fund is so helpful, they lack the resources to apply for funding. Communities that lack resources, whether it be urban or rural, don't often have people to write grants or write for funds. So a peer-to-peer initiative among resourced utilities with less resourced utilities would be really helpful to help communities like Flint and Gary to apply for funds that are available to them. And NACWA, the Association of Clean Water Agencies, and EPA are working together on a peer-to-peer network to try to assist utilities with that. And the other thing, I agree with you, Ranking Member Westerman, those are public partnerships, peer-to-peer, but public-private partnerships are helpful too. And we were able to use them in some design-build contracts, power purchase agreement to put solar in. So these opportunities are available. I would really like to thank you all for your interest in the water sector, the importance of the drinking water and wastewater protection. I'll just say one last thing. This is an opportunity for a win-win. President Roosevelt put in the Civilian Conservation Corps to put people to work, to build infrastructure. President Eisenhower did the same with the interstate highway system in the 50s. This is a tremendous opportunity to put our citizens to work, to protect our environment, and rebuild our water infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Ms. Heeps.
Good morning, Chairwoman Napolitano, Ranking Member Westerman, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Jill Witkowski Heeps, visiting scholar at the University at Buffalo School of Law and assistant professor at Vermont Law School. I also serve as vice chair of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, a federal advisory committee to EPA on environmental justice. I chaired a work group which wrote the report, EPA's Role in Addressing the Urgent Water Infrastructure Needs of Environmental Justice Communities. That report is being delivered to Administrator Wheeler this week. I'm happy to submit to you a report of the copy when it's available. I'm here today speaking in my individual capacity. The city of Buffalo has invested more than $150 million in its water infrastructure over the past 10 years. But Buffalo needs to raise water revenues to pay for more improvements, including a $500 million program to address the city's lead poisoning problem by replacing 41,000 lead-containing resident service lines. Many Buffalo residents already have problems paying their water bills. More than 30% of the households are at or below the federal poverty level. Approximately 200 households a month have their water shut off. On January 1st, 2019, Buffalo adopted an affordability program along with its water rates increase. But the city will see more shutoffs despite the new program. Why? First, the program only sought to cover the cost of the rate increase, even though the city already had water affordability issues. Second, even though 40,000 households will be eligible for the program, Buffalo estimates 10% participation in the program. That means 36,000 households living paycheck to paycheck will see a 17% increase in their bills. Third, the city could increase the capacity charge, not the cost of water itself, so families cannot avoid increased bills by conserving water. This example demonstrates at least two things. One, decades of infrastructure underfunding have left systems crumbling. Families are now struggling to pay larger and larger water bills as utilities are raising rates to pay for delayed investments. This problem isn't unique to Buffalo. According to a Michigan State University study, in 2014, approximately 13.8 million households likely struggled to pay their water bills. The second lesson is that utilities need help designing and implementing effective programs that will actually address water affordability issues. We need congressional action to solve this problem. I have 6 recommendations to share with you today. First, Congress needs to massively increase federal government investment in water infrastructure. While the proposed $4 billion appropriation for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund is an improvement over past years, $6 billion would bring investment back up to Reagan-era levels. But even that's not enough. Congress must take bold action to fill the $600 billion funding gap for water and wastewater infrastructure. The Water Act of 2019, which creates a $35 billion trust fund to invest in water infrastructure improvements, is a good start. Second, federal water infrastructure funding should provide more grants to the neediest communities. The neediest communities often struggle to qualify for loans or even apply for grants, particularly where utilities are run by volunteers. States should be proactively identifying and reaching out to these communities who may not be aware of grant opportunities. Third, Congress should recognize that water is a human right. Everyone should have access to clean, safe drinking water and sanitation. Congress can recognize this in a standalone law modeled after California's right to water law or in water affordability legislation. Fourth, Congress should create a federal block grant program to directly assist households in paying water and sewer bills. This can be modeled after the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, LIHEAP. Fifth, we need legislation promoting water affordability. This legislation should prioritize solutions that provide low-income customers the dignity of paying their bills without having to enroll in an assistance program. Structuring rates in a way that keeps essential water usage affordable for everyone promotes equity, incentivizes water conservation, eases stress on the sewage system, and addresses concerns where state law, like California, provides hurdles to affordability programs. The Honolulu program is a good example of an essential needs rate structure. Any legislation helping utilities adopt a customer assistance program needs to ensure programs are thoughtfully designed and well implemented based on a community's particular challenges. As Ms. Flowers said, we need to listen to the communities and they need to have input in these programs as they're being developed. Philadelphia's tiered assistance program is an excellent model of where bills for low-income residents are capped based on income. Programs should automatically enroll customers using existing eligibility requirements from other sectors, like food stamps and SNAP. Finally, all communities deserve clean water now. The fact that families in a community are struggling with household water affordability should not be an excuse for regulated entities pushing Clean Water Act compliance back for decades. Congress should fund programs like WIFIA that can provide significant financial assistance to help bring water and sewer systems into compliance as quickly as possible. Communities can then work to pay back those funds over time, spreading the cost of upgrades over decades while getting clean water now. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today. I'd be delighted to serve as a resource as this committee continues to craft solutions to address these daunting issues. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Heeps. And now I would defer to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio, for any comment he may have. Mr. DeFazio, recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was over speaking to the airports about their needs and unfortunately couldn't be here at the beginning of the hearing. I did want to provide this small recognition of for your chairpersonship, chairwomanship, however one properly says that, chair. Just chair. And you know, I feel very strongly about the federal government's role in this. I was a county commissioner when my two largest cities, Eugene and Springfield, I live in Springfield, for years couldn't agree on even putting their waste together. But when I got on the county, we finally formed a metropolitan wastewater district. And we built out a system that has served us well, and the population has just about doubled in the time period since I was a commissioner, and we're still not at capacity, but we were able to do that because we got a massive infusion of funds from the federal government. We got an 80-20 share. We put up 20, they put up 80. And then in the rates, we put in rates basically an additional charge, but the rates were very affordable to build a capital fund to replace the system when it wears out. So, I mean, it was a great investment by the federal government, and other communities certainly need that partnership. I think we've had some great examples. I really like the, just unfortunately only came into here in New Jersey and didn't hear the others, but the idea of building your new system to be resilient, self-sufficient in terms of energy, you know, those are really great points. And the fact that you're able to do it without a rate increase is fairly astounding, given what's the interest rate on the SRF, do you know?
It's less than 1%, and that makes the difference between go and no-go.
Wow.
Because the interest rate is so low,
Yeah.
spread it over 30 years, so we can do that without raising rates. The
Right.
conventional rate would be like 4.5% to 5%. We'd have to raise rates significantly in order to do the same thing.
Right. When we had a select committee on privatization a few years ago, appointed by Chairman Schuster, at the beginning there was a lot of enthusiasm among some members on the idea that you know, these should be private-public partnerships, and by the end most members agreed that you know, it just wasn't going to work because of the costs and the expected rates of return that many of the P3s want. There is no one who's going to lend you money at less than 1% in the private sector. I mean, they're looking at very high rates of return. So I want to thank the chairwoman for convening the hearing. I want to look into some of the other issues that were raised about, you know, the examples of the right to water and those things, and hopefully we can not only reauthorize the SRF, but look at other ways that we can help communities that are very low income or disadvantaged in other ways to get what I think I would agree with the panel should be a right not to pollute with wastewater, and a right to have clean, potable, and safe drinking water. So with that, Madam Chair, I thank you for holding this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio,
You
and
going
I
to
agree
display your
with you.
gift? There.
Got my name on it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. DeFazio, much appreciated. We start the questioning off, and I will have 5 minutes to do it just like everybody else. The first question for Ms. Flowers. And I was shocked to read your testimony and learn that over 30% of the samples from Loudoun County tested positive for hookworm. The disease no longer thought alive in this country. What does it say about the federal government's commitment to clean water, healthy communities that our people in this country are still suffering from?
I think what it says about the federal government is that there are some people that have been left behind. And when we heard about Flint and what happened in Flint, we often said that part of Flint's problem was flawed infrastructure. There are large parts of the United States that has no infrastructure at all. And for me, having grown up in that area, I thought that was normal until I went to other parts of the country and saw that it wasn't. And it's even more astounding when the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, who I invited to come to visit Lowndes County, saw that and said that what he saw there was uncommon in the first world.
Well, it just is unreal, to be honest with you, and I think we've learned a lot, and we hopefully will address it in the future, both in the FDA and EPA and all the other agencies that should have been looking for that. Next question from Ms. Taylor. In your testimony, you talk about the automation has displaced workers. Cities like Detroit experience unemployment and declining rate base. Because of that, residents are unable to pay their bills, including water, and are faced with water shutoffs and additional consequences you noted in your testimony. In your opinion, do shutoffs help address the issue of affordability, or do they contribute to more poverty? You also discussed your testimony to the idea of addressing affordability based on the customer's ability to pay. Why is that a preferred approach to shutoffs?
Shutoffs highlight poverty. Shutoffs mean that whoever is in charge of making certain that citizens are safe are asleep at the wheel. Shutoffs don't have to occur if, in fact, there is a priority set that establishes water and access to water and clean sanitation as a human right. If we start with that as a priority, then what we do as mothers and fathers, like we would do in our homes, we set policies based on what the priorities are. So if you have shutoffs like I have in my city, thousands and thousands. I remember the first shutoff case. A young woman had 2 jobs, and she lost them both. She has 4 little girls, and they were taken out of the house and put into 3 foster care homes. The foster care people pay $465 per child. The water bill was only $1,100. The children stayed in foster care for 18 months. That becomes an issue. So what shutoffs do is that they highlight the problem, and they most certainly contribute to ongoing poverty.
I'm sorry, Mr. Graves was my prior chair, and so I was welcoming him back to the committee. Thank you very much for your testimony. The question for Ms. Heeps, you mentioned you chaired a work group of National Environmental Justice Advisory Council and wrote a report on EPA's role in addressing urgent water infrastructure needs of Environmental Justice Committee. Would you please give a copy of that report to this committee? We have not seen that.
Yes, it's being delivered to Administrator Wheeler this week. As soon as I have the go from EPA, I'd be happy to deliver it to you.
Thank you. You have just heard examples of what is happening in Michigan and Alabama, how low-income communities or individuals may not be able to afford clean drinking water and wastewater services. In your opinion, what can we do to ensure every American and every community across the country has access to these utilities?
I think there's 3 things. A shift in how we view water, the actual funding issue, federal funding, increasing federal funding, and guaranteeing community participation in developing solutions. Congress can take a huge role in leading a fundamental shift of how we as Americans view water, from viewing it as a commodity to viewing it as a human right. Our Declaration of Independence views life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness as an inalienable right, but there's no life without water. We need to recognize this and find ways that everyone living in America can have access to water for life and sanitation for life. Second, we need more funding, and I can think about at least 5 different types of funding: the clean water and drinking water SRFs to support infrastructure at the utility level. Programs like WIFIA, which provides supplemental funding for significant projects. That's been a huge game changer, especially in San Diego. They just got a $16 million WIFIA grant for Pure Water San Diego project, which is indirect potable reuse, which is addressing not only San Diego's drinking water issue, but their sewage issue as well. We need money for water affordability programs to support utilities adopting customer assistance programs. We need block grants that go straight to the customers. Clean Water SRF is great, but it trickles down from the federal government to the states, to the utilities, and then the utilities might get it to the customers. We need something directly to the customers. And then also, I think we also need big funding grants for our most critical issues, like dealing with these rural sewage issues.
Thank you very much. I think I better go on to my next question for Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. Ms. Flowers, as you talked about your life experiences, it kind of took me a little bit back down memory lane. I know growing up in rural Arkansas, the little country church I went to as a kid, it had a single hole outhouse with the sanitary facilities there. Now, it cut down on the number of church members getting up and going to the restroom during church. You only went there if it was an absolute emergency. But I think sometimes we forget to appreciate how far we've come when we're looking at where we need to be. I know my parents, not my grandparents, but my parents talked about when they got running water and electricity in their homes, and then my grandparents had much more. They saw much more technology advances in their life. So as we look at this issue, and affordability seems to be a major problem, and we've talked about that some here. And there's always two sides to the coin on affordability. For one thing, I think we put regulations in place sometimes that falsely drive up the cost that need to be there. There's this concept of diminishing returns. You can try to do something perfect, but at some point the cost greatly exceeds the benefits. And Mayor Condon, you mentioned in your written testimony, talked about state water quality standards for PCBs at 7 parts per quadrillion. It was a good illustration you used there. You can't even measure that, but it's a standard that's out there. And I know I used to serve in the Arkansas legislature, and one of the first occurrences I had to deal with a situation like this, I had constituents come in and tell me that in their drinking water system, the dissolved mineral content in their drinking water didn't meet EPA standards, and they were going to have to put demineralization equipment in for their drinking water. Now, to country folks, you're telling them this is safe to drink, but you can't water your grass with it. And sometimes it doesn't make sense. So I don't think that just throwing money at the problem is always the answer. I think there's ways we can be smarter about how we put the policies and standards in place. And Mayor Condon, I wanted to get you to elaborate a little bit on that, and also maybe an idea of what's good for a major city versus a rural area. Are there certain standards that could provide sanitary sewer systems and clean drinking water, but not have the extra cost added onto it that you might see in a larger metropolitan area?
Thank you for the question. You hit the nail on the head. I talked about originally when I came into office, the expected cost of our program was about $500 million. Literally in my inbox were 2 contracts that were waiting to be signed for, I believe, about $38 million just to manage that. As we came back to D.C. this time in 2012, that's where I was presented with a choice. Mayor, ask for a consent decree and blame it on us, or we're thinking about this idea of integrated planning. So we cut about $150 million out of that cost. And everyone goes, well, you're not meeting the regulation, obviously. There's no way you could. Well, the reality is what you just said. In integrated planning, there's other ways of looking at how you meet the requirement. We were going to a level for regulatory purposes, a level that was insurmountable. You cannot, we can't even test below 170 parts per quadrillion, and our state standard is 7. And so as you look at this, we right now, as I have been lauded, I received the national award from NACWA several years ago. I've been, in our plan, been quoted in both the Obama administration and now in the Trump administration from EPA that we were leading the country. We were literally doing integrated planning based off of a memo, which is not a great place to be. So thank you for the law. But now we're ready to go sign that permit as we're in our final year of the largest infrastructure project that my community has ever seen. Yet they say, well, you're going to have to meet 7 now. My citizens are going to pay that bill for the next 17 years. We are one of the first in the country to sell green bonds, some $200 million in green bonds as part of that $350 million cost. So now we need to meet 7. Some estimates have it up to $1 billion to meet 7. our wastewater treatment facility is using technology that's used for drinking water to get it to a standard to put back into our Spokane River, which is literally the center point of our community and has been for years. And so I sit there, and as you look at it, it really is the framework that allows us to look at the cost rather than always going to try to alleviate that cost on the final end. You really need to look at the construction side of that. We have some other 144 other contaminants that we should be looking towards to remove from our river rather than going back to PCBs to try to get to this unreasonable level that no one can actually get to or prove that you were to it. So as I've sat in many meetings with our state folks, with the EPA, and I sat here several years ago. I meet with the EPA constantly, and they said, yes, Mayor, it's hard to justify. Well, I have to justify it to my citizens. That's the reality. So as we look at this and as you look at these programs, regulatory innovation and innovations to meet those requirements is so key. I'll finish with this, and that is, as we look at these programs, especially in a delegated state like ours, our state has never had a variance to meet this.
Our graceful chair is not going to show me mercy if we don't yield back.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Mr. Espaillat, you're on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. The Clean Water State Revolving Fund and its sister program, the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, are vital importance to New York City and New York State and cities around the country, really. The New York City Department of Environmental Protection owns and operates one of the largest wastewater collection and treatment systems in the world, with 96 pumping stations and 14 treatment plants. And while our waterways in the New York area are cleaner now than they've been in a century, in fact, the Hudson River right now, it's a playground for sports and other activities, there's still so much work to be done. In Upper Manhattan, combined sewer overflow tanks release gallons of dirty water directly into the Hudson whenever too much rainfalls quickly happens. This happens on a regular basis, so anytime you have storms, untreated sewage water is released into the Hudson where people are kayaking and doing water sports. We saw this happen all over the city during Superstorm Sandy as well, when not only rainfall but also storm surge waters overwhelm our system, damage our infrastructure, and dirty our waterways. After the storm, it was determined that part or all of our 14 treatment plants and more than half of our pumping stations are at risk and could suffer more than $1 billion in damage in a single storm or flood. New York has been putting FEMA resiliency funds to work in order to make upgrades to our clean water system, but the Clean Water State Revolving Fund is still so vital for long-term upgrades. A city of nearly 9 million people can witness a great damage to our clean water and environment if we don't invest in maintaining our water infrastructure. The compounding impacts of climate change make this work even more critical. New York City has a wastewater resiliency plan that calls for critical equipment to be protected to the 100-year base flood elevation plus an additional 32 inches to account for sea level rise. But New York and other cities around the country simply cannot meet this challenge without federal investment. So the buck stops here. This is a deep pocket issue, and we must be a full partner. Federal funding through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund will go towards raising low-laying wastewater treatment facilities and other ways to make them more resilient. But even more important, the Clean Water SRF will help make the system greener. New York City would like to upgrade all of our wastewater plants to replace their engines with ones that use cleaner natural gas and even green energy. This will not only make our water cleaner, it will at the same time make our air cleaner by reducing emissions, and it helps to combat climate change by reducing our footprint. So this is a major endeavor, and we need money. And so in an era where we see the White House speaking about budget cuts, and we are here sitting in transportation infrastructure trying to wrestle with a potential major infrastructure bill. What do you recommend about the money, the green money that must come to ensure that we, in addition to some of the measures that have, for example, have been taken in Spokane, what do you recommend that we do to make this happen before the infrastructure in America collapses?
Well, we've been very lucky with the state revolving fund on both of the issues you described. Camden City has a combined sewer system, and we have used the state revolving fund to upgrade our wastewater treatment plant to make it bigger, to upgrade Camden City's sewer system to allow it to convey more flow to the plant. And we've also greened 100 acres through a green infrastructure program, all funded through the SRF, to capture 100 million gallons of stormwater by soaking it through the ground. And then good begets good. Because we now have 100 acres of parkland that we have to manage, we used an AmeriCorps grant to hire 240 at-risk youth between 18 and 25 to maintain the green infrastructure. So green infrastructure not only has a functional benefit of capturing stormwater, but also greens the city, has those benefits, but also there are green job opportunities. On the green energy side, we're using, so through the SRF, we'll have eliminated combined sewage flooding for up to the 1-inch storm in Camden by the end of 2020. And then for green energy, we are using the SRF again to make our plant completely resilient. We'll be off the grid by the end of 2020 by using the SRF to build a digester facility and a combined heat and power system to turn our sludge, our biosolids, into electricity. So without the state revolving fund, we could not do that. So we thank the government and the EPA for the state revolving fund and hope that you will reauthorize it and re-up it. And remember, it's a loan program, not a grant, so it really is a hand up, not a hand out. We have to pay it back, but that low interest rate makes the difference.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, sir, for your testimony. Mr. Webster, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Professor, are the rates paid for water and wastewater treatment? Are they way low, medium, too high, or is it a mix?
Thank you for the question. I think the answer depends on where you are and who you ask. I think in many communities we have what's considered reasonable water and sewer rates, but many people struggle. And I think one of the challenges of setting affordable rates is that in many places, the cost of water itself is very, very cheap. And the cost of the infrastructure, the energy to move the water is what's very expensive. So often rates are structured in a way that I've seen recommendations that say, make your fixed costs of your infrastructure the base rate for all your ratepayers, and then the cost of water, your flexible costs go beyond that. So often what we have is, for somebody who uses very little water, it's very expensive for them to just even get in the game and turn on water at their home. And if we were able to have more sliding rates that recognized very low usage of water, had very low water costs, I think we could see a more equitable system and have the larger water users actually paying a more equitable cost of their burden on the system.
So should the federal government get engaged in any way in setting rates?
I think that there we're talking about a federalism issue that rate setting has been a local issue and a state level issue. And unlike with energy, where we have public utility commissions, often water rates are Wild West, kind of all over the place. But I think the federal government can provide incentives to good policies at a local level by tying federal monetary support to policies that support water affordability at a local level.
So that would be like a shared expense. The better you do, the better the federal government will do.
I think we can reward systems that end up well structured to deal with both affordability and Clean Water Act compliance issues.
Does the diversity play into that somewhere? I mean, I think about Florida, there's water, it's almost like a wetland. And so, especially in the middle of South Florida, and so you can dig down a few feet, maybe 5 feet, and there's water. as opposed to other places. Now, certainly it's not, it needs to be cleaned up or whatever, but however, the point is when you do septic tanks or something like that, then there's a difference than if they were done in some other state. So does the topology play a role in that?
Yes, absolutely. And as Ms. Flowers' testimony demonstrated, there's no one-size-fits-all solution for every community. We need to look specifically at what engineering solutions will work and what makes sense for local communities.
So, but that affects rates too. There may be a simple way to do it in one part of the country and a little more complex in another part of the country. Is that true?
I would agree with that, yes.
Okay. Yield back.
Thank you. I now yield to Ms. Fickenhauer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Happy to sit on this subcommittee and be here with you all today. And thank you so much for all that you are doing. I know you are dedicated, as I am, to making sure that every single American has access to clean, safe drinking water. It is one of our #1 priorities around here. And again, thank you for being here today. One of the things that I'm really curious about, because I come from the city of Dubuque and have seen some really innovative things around water quality and partnerships, and a lot of technology in regards to, using technology to monitor and improve water systems. So where I'm from in Dubuque, they have actually partnered with IBM's Watson Research Center, where they did a smarter water pilot study for over a year. Some of you may or may not have heard of it, but where they use actually smart water meters to help reduce water usage over 6%, and then increase leak detection, and and response was 8-fold. So I just kind of want to hear from you all today about intelligent systems, and specifically, how can we use technology to reduce leaks and other causes of system downtime, as well as making sure that our water systems are more environmentally sustainable. Are there anything that you have seen across the country, whether local, state level? Obviously, I know the Dubuque example, but wondering if you all have any examples that states or other localities have done well, and anything that we should be looking at on the federal level to either ramp up or be helpful with this to, again, use the technology we do have and make sure that every dollar we do spend, we're doing it in the best way possible and in the most efficient way possible.
Well, non-revenue water is a huge problem for every community, but especially in communities, whether it's a city or a rural, that are lower resourced. So, for example, the norm is like in a well-run system, there's always going to be some leaks, maybe 10%, but the Camden City, for example, has a non-revenue water of over 40%. So that means that for every 100 gallons that go out of their water treatment system, they only get paid for 60. Now, some of that goes for fire and firefighting, and that's normal. But a lot of it's for leaks or unbilled revenue. So that's a huge loss for a city that needs revenue. But it's sort of a vicious cycle, because if you lack the resources to find the leaks, then you can't find the revenue that you need. So I've heard of the smart water systems too, but usually it's a public-private partnership, which is at a much higher rate. So one thing the federal government could do, because the technologies are out there, would be to, through the clean water SRF, the drinking water SRF, allow rural and urban communities to borrow and invest in that smart technology to reduce their non-revenue water, and then that revenue would help pay back the loan. It would pay for itself. So, but the problem is that many of these communities that need it the most can't afford them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
I was going to say, the technology is a key component. As a city that is going to all smart meters and looking at the real-time use. One is real-time reporting back to the users, especially large users. In our system, we're thinking of golf courses and parks to give people that real solution. The other is technology and leak detection. We used more recently inline technology. that saved us some $7 million because, of course, there's algorithms based on years and gallons through certain systems because you didn't know what was under the ground. Now using certain types of technology, we were able to alleviate a $7 million that was in our capital plan. But again, back to the issues of partnering with technology. One is the real-time reporting to use, and we'll be a fully automated city here shortly through a smart city initiative. But again, that's all privately done, which is great because they're coming to the table to demonstrate those. But secondly is to use that sort of technology that had typically been on the wastewater side. But again, as we are here about wastewater, the real issue is the clean water solutions on the drinking water also.
And if I could add, technology can also benefit affordability. If you have real-time reporting and residential customers have that, and you have rates structured so that people can have control of their bill and actually use less water, people can say, oh, I'm going to take a shorter shower today, or we're going to save laundry till next week, or something like that. So it really benefits all around, both from the utility end and the consumer end.
Great. Thank you all so much for your comments, and I'd love to follow up on some of this as well. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. We now recognize Mr. Babin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here today. We appreciate it. Mazinski, right? That's why Mazinski?
Moksiski, yes.
Moksinsky. Okay, I'm sorry.
No.
I represent a large district in Texas, 9 counties from Houston over to Louisiana. The majority of my constituents live in rural communities. And you talk about the difficulties that rural communities face with respect to and compliance with federal regulations due to a lack of technical resources. You mentioned that compliance is expensive, it's complex, and burdensome to small communities who have minimal resources and personnel. And I can understand issues very similar to yours in my district. Many of my constituents are suffering at the hands of over-regulation from federal government in many areas of their lives already. In your testimony, you lay out 5 provisions which aim to help target communities most in need of federal assistance. Do you think that these provisions are sustainable and for solving the long-term issues that rural communities like ours face?
I think they're sustainable. I think it just needs to be there needs to be enough money in the fund so that more people can participate in these rural communities. The rural communities need the technical assistance that we get from, like, the Rural Water Association, because for us, even a small project, we had a wellhead protection project that we did in our town. It was going to cost us $75,000. For a small rural community, $75,000 is a lot of money. We were fortunate that through clean water funding and through the New York Rural Water Association, their hydrogeologist did the program for us, saved us $75,000. Our wellhead was protected. That allowed us to get this wellhead protection done, because what happens in the small communities is that that work just doesn't get done if there's not some sort of outside funding to help with it.
All right, well, let me follow this up. Do you see an opportunity for the private sector to bring solutions to some of these problems?
I don't see how that would work. It's just going to be a little bit more expensive if private entities come into the picture because they need to get paid.
Okay. Okay, and then Ms. Flowers, decentralized wastewater recycling technology has been proven in many rural infrastructure cases to be cost-effective and a sustainable solution to rural wastewater issues. How can we better utilize and implement these new technologies in rural or even urban communities to best maximize taxpayer dollars?
Well, I think that, first of all, the technologies that have been used in our communities have not worked. And I think the first thing we have to do is acknowledge that we probably need to do something differently. I was just in Florida where I saw they're having problems where they have to remove septic systems because of the rising sea levels and the water tables are rising. I think the technologies that have been created were created for 20 years ago. We have a new reality now. We have more rain, and the technologies that the people that I'm dealing with are talking about every time it rains, they're dealing with sewage coming back into their homes. Mm-hmm. So we need to really, I think one of the big problems that I found, being a country girl myself, is that a lot of people that are making policies have never been to these rural areas. So it's hard to articulate to someone who can't even imagine
That's right.
what it's like to be in a community where your cell phone doesn't work because the signal, you won't get it. You know, you can't rely on GPS to go to some of these places. And I have to tell people coming from the cities all the time, you better write those directions down or you're going to end up lost.
Right.
So the same thing is true when we deal with wastewater. I think that there has to be a concerted effort, and maybe one of the ways to address this is to put together a committee that can actually go and visit these areas and see that these technologies are simply not working.
Okay.
Nobody goes to the homeowner who's on the other end when they fail.
You bet.
They go to the people that install them. And lastly, I think that the other problem that I've seen with the funding, the people that get the funding are not necessarily the people that need them. The business community can always get the funding. We have an example right now in Lowndes County where the business community on 65 just got funding to put in wastewater treatment because they have failed septic systems too.
Let me ask,
but the community is left out.
thank you very much for that, and I appreciate that. I want to ask Ms. Taylor something real quick. In your testimony, you discussed the dangers of privatizing water infrastructure, and what do you think is a good balance between private entities and government funding when it comes to water safety and infrastructure? In addition, if you would discuss a few policies that would allow the private sector and the federal government to work together in these areas. If you could, just for a few seconds.
Profound question, because I think all across America, we're all trying to find a way to work with the federal government. Everybody is. Even in this discussion today, I worry that people are not really listening. I listened to what Ms. Katherine said. Private monies coming into public dollars generally means something bad is going to happen, and that's what it means. This is not rocket scientists. It's not rocket activities. All we have to do is to decide that water is a human right. And if we do that, then we will establish policies and practices to make it so.
Ms.
It
Taylor.
is something to be said about throwing money at a problem. People that have money always say, can't throw money at it, it won't fix it. Throw money at me and watch me fix things.
Ms. Taylor, thank
All
you
right,
so
thank
much.
you.
The time is up. If you'd like, you can always provide testimony in writing to add to that. I now recognize Mr. Ruda for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, witnesses, for joining us today. Appreciate your testimony and information that you're sharing. My district is the 48th District of California in Orange County. And we're served by the Orange County Water District and the Orange County Sanitation District. In fact, in February 2018, the Orange County Water District in Fountain Valley and the Orange County Sanitation District in Fountain Valley as well set a Guinness World Record title for the most wastewater recycled to drinking water in 24 hours. They serve 2.4 million residents and have certainly relied on SRFs in the past to help create world-class operations in Orange County. But California has about $26 billion of needs in this area, and I think federally the number is around $270 billion. And Professor, I'll start with you. You've talked about the need for massive amounts of money to address our water infrastructure needs. Can you talk a little bit about the impact climate change has on these calculations? Because it seems like these calculations are based on historical information and not really taking into account the full potential impact of climate change if it's not adequately addressed in the very near term.
Yes, thank you. And actually, I've toured that Orange County facility twice. It's a wonderful.
It is quite impressive.
Wonderful facility. I think you raise an excellent question about, are we really counting cost considering climate change and resiliency for our water infrastructure? The latest numbers that I've seen from EPA on the Clean Water Act needs, at least on the Clean Water Act side, the drinking water side, new numbers came out in 2018, but on the Clean Water Act side, the latest numbers are from 2012. And that report itself acknowledges it's supposed to be a 20-year estimate, but that actually that utilities often look out 5 years. So those numbers are likely very, very low. And one of the things I would encourage this subcommittee to do is to connect with EPA and ask when the new numbers are going to be out, and to specifically ask how climate change resiliency and impacts on climate change for both water and sewer are going to impact those numbers, and then also provide guidance to the utilities, to the local municipalities as they're trying to figure that out and trying to figure out how those numbers change with new threats from climate change.
And anybody else on the panel want to speak to the topic?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. I mean, you know, I'm from New Jersey, and so Hurricane Sandy, you know, that's climate history, and the storms from Houston, Puerto Rico, et cetera, we've seen that our infrastructure is already inadequate for how the climate is already. So there's already a significant infrastructure gap, even if the climate doesn't get any worse. So we have to address that. But then, of course, many believe that the climate change will get worse, and so that will only widen the gap. So the need for investment in water infrastructure is more important than ever. One, for replacement of the water infrastructure while we have it now, but also to provide resiliency, especially for vulnerable communities, from power outages, low-lying areas, et cetera. So I believe that we must close the water infrastructure gap while we can, since we already see the infrastructure is inadequate, and we know that gap will only widen.
Thank you. And turning a little bit, Mayor, to what I believe you talked about earlier, my neighbor to the north in Los Angeles have plans in place to reclaim the LA River and restore it back to natural habitat to some degree. And I'm certainly intrigued that we can do the same in my district with the Santa Ana River, because I think you have shown and others have shown that there is a partnership between man-made infrastructure and natural habitat. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the cost effectiveness of doing so?
Absolutely. You can see in number 2 in my handout that we took this integration idea all the way throughout our city. And so now in our community, the streets department used to be part of the city government proper, is now part of the utilities division, and they pay a franchise fee for that. But they get to design our streets predominantly around stormwater. So now our stormwater mitigation, people talk about complete streets or integrated streets. Well, now we look at every square foot that's not pavement that we didn't need because we used to collect stormwater. We now can infiltrate that. There's 2 other things, though. There's no money for integrated projects, so I spoke about it in my testimony, which was we have to go to many different sources, line those sources up, and I feel dramatic for our rural partners. I have a whole department that does that. I'm in Eastern Washington. We're the largest city in Eastern Washington of a large congressional district. But when working with Congress, if we could have an integrated fund that actually looks at all these solutions. The other is the regulation. Believe it or not, we could purple pipe everything. But my river has a right to that water, so we cannot actually remove it from the river and put it into purple pipe. And number 2 is we have health requirements that don't allow purple pipe to go on to anywhere that's going to have human contact, i.e. Parks. You can't have purple pipe in parks because if kids play on it, yet the drinking or the wastewater standard is higher than our drinking water standard, yet health departments across this country and perhaps regulatory don't allow that to be into public spaces because it might have contact. So I think you're right on going down the right path, but really looking at the regulations that conflict between the different components of the federal government. And the final piece is we should reward these integrated projects throughout the system and have a single source for those projects.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Condon. Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Woodall for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll pick up, Mayor, where my colleague left off. It is an amazing thing that you all have done, bringing economic incentives. It's easier to invest $350 million if I can save $150 million along the way. I believe there should be a different set of regulations for the best actors in our community. We're using that same membrane technology in my suburb north of Atlanta. We're pumping our water back into our reservoir cleaner than we took it out, just like you are. Tell me about the efficacy from an executive's perspective of having a different set of standards for the good actors and a training wheels set of standards for those folks that we're still trying to get up to code.
Well, thank you, because I am not the nerd in the room. I'm not an engineer by any means, but to see it from my perspective as running a large utility, you hit the nail on the head, which is to give rewards to those that are innovative. I was one of the first in the country to do integrated planning. We're now going to have trouble signing a permit because they're going to try to hold us to a standard that no technology in this community in this country can meet. Rather, we'd like to start spending those dollars where our citizens see it. I passed a street levy, received 77% passage because they saw the integrated effectiveness of that, and they see the real world outcomes from that. From my handout, you see that now our CSO tanks have parks on them for one of our school, or a playground for one of our schools. We actually had to come all the way back here to the Department of Transportation. One of our infiltration sites is land that the federal government owns along I-90, one of the federal highways. It originally had been a place where a considerable amount of vagrancy had happened, and it was very unsafe for the individuals that were there. It's now an infiltration site, but the federal government had never allowed this to happen because it was on their property on an on-ramp. But saving, this is how we were to look at saving that $150 million. The citizens see that. I come from a part of the country that is very progressive in environmental standards. But that being said, they also are very cognizant of the cost. And my citizens, one of the poorest legislative districts in the state, and as you see from the ALICE rate, you know, a family of 4 is left with $400 or $500 to pay for rent when you take out the utility costs. So we need to look at these innovative approaches, but also look at somewhere in the federal government where you can have that integrated approach. We get points for integration, but we still are applying on multiple different locations or sources to get those dollars, and then lining up the cash flow when those are due, when they have to be spent by, and it's a Rubik's Cube that is not plausible for smaller governments. We're able to do it, but we're at about 210,000. I don't think you could do it for cities much smaller than that.
Yeah, but for cities north of 210,000, do you think this is a model that is applicable across the country, or you have the particular leadership and the particular circumstances that you can make it work when others can't?
I would hope the latter. I'd think the latter, but no, it's replicable. The issue is, and that's why when you simplify it and have grant pools that reward a single location for these integrated projects, I realize the difficulty. I worked in the federal government for some time, but you have some instances where this has happened throughout, whether it be at the Department of Transportation and the safer or the grants that came out that looked at integrating different projects, and so I think it can be done, especially on the authorization side, especially when we look at policy of how that could be rewarded for innovation across this country, because we can drop that cost and get real benefits to our citizens. Believe it or not, most of my citizens, thankfully, when they flush the toilet, it flushes the same way before we did $350 million and the same way afterwards. So they've got to see the ability and see the real outcomes, and they've seen that in their infrastructure in my community, and really have rewarded us in giving us that confidence to continue down this path.
As we've seen water costs in major cities go up 50% over the last 10 years, with Atlanta and Seattle, your neighbor to the west, the two highest in that measure. Yes, constituents are.
I got elected because of water rates.
Is it Mr. Kryken? Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes, sir.
Your peer-to-peer sharing idea is really interesting to me. Who's doing that the best today? Because I sometimes see my communities compete with one another, and so they don't want a partner to help each other succeed. Who's doing it well, and what can we do to make that more successful going forward?
Well, thank you. The National Association of Clean Water Agencies and EPA and Water Environment Federation are working together to develop a 50-state peer-to-peer initiative in which utilities with larger resources would help those with less. So, for example, the way our regional authority helps Camden City. Camden City is one of the poorest cities in the country. Our county is a regional authority with some affluent communities as well, so we partner with them. In New Jersey, where the commissioner has developed a peer-to-peer program of 8 utilities helping the more challenged cities across the state. We're hoping to replicate that across the country. San Francisco is also doing a lot in the Bay Area. Actually, the city of Atlanta is very involved in water equity issues as well, with your Commissioner Keisha Powell. So, I mean, there's a lot of examples. The idea is to try to coalesce that into a national initiative, because nobody should have to deal with these issues. And the thing is, real quick, in the public sector, we're willing to share the information. So we're glad to share it. We just need mechanisms to help facilitate that sharing, those partnerships.
I had many more questions for many more witnesses, Madam Chair, but I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Woodall. I would like to recognize myself now for 5 minutes. Thank you so much to the witnesses here this morning. I represent Florida's 26th district. It is, as I say, ground zero for the effects of climate change, and water is a daily topic for us. As you can imagine, we have had serious issues threatening the water infrastructure in my community, dealing with, flooding. The water continues. We have septic tanks, about 90,000 septic tanks in Miami-Dade County. This was done because it was less costly at the time, so a lot of overdevelopment without really providing the appropriate municipal infrastructure that is needed. You have all seen the algae blooms that we have been suffering from in both of our coasts. There's also such a divide in Miami-Dade County. We have some of the highest number of millionaires that live along the coastal communities, but then the average income for people living in most of the county is about $44,000. So you can imagine how costly it is for our communities to actually invest in the appropriate infrastructure. So programs like the Clean Water SRF are crucial, and we have used the SRF program to obtain low-interest loans to move residents from septic to sewer, constructing treatment systems to improve the water quality of the nearshore waters, and protecting the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. So I'd like to start with Ms. Flowers, something that you said a little bit earlier. You mentioned that you saw some creative solutions to the septic tank issues in South Florida. If you could please elaborate on that.
Actually, I didn't see creative solutions. I was at the University of Florida recently, and they were talking about the problems they're having with wastewater treatment there, using septic systems. And they said the problem is because of the sea level rise, and the water tables are rising, and as a result, the technology is failing, and it's leaching into the groundwater and ends up in the rivers and so forth, which creates the algae bloom and sometimes fish kills. So what I'm hoping would come of this, if I had a magic wand, I would try to partner with some of the agencies that are already dealing with innovative technology, like NASA, for an example. I'm trying to get to NASA because they treat wastewater in outer space. And people think I'm crazy when I say this, but I believe that we could partner with them and come up with a way to treat wastewater in an innovative way that is affordable, that you can go to a Lowe's or Home Depot and buy it, like we do with an HVAC system, and hire a technician to go and install it. But we have to start thinking out of the box. The way we're thinking is for technology or for a time that was when I was a child. Now, at the age of 60, you know, I never could have imagined. I remember when we had party lines. Now we have cell phones. You know, some people don't even know what I'm talking about. But anyway, now we have cell phones, and we can't even imagine what it was like to live without them. I think we can do the same thing with wastewater, but I think we have to get to the point where we can start thinking out of the box, and I think that we have such ingenuity in this country that if we can galvanize it and through possibly a public-private partnership and come up with the kinds of solutions that will help people in Miami, people in Alabama. In Alabama, they tell us that the best soils for treating wastewater are sandy soils. When I went to Florida, I saw that was something different. So we really need to find a way to develop the type of technologies that do take into account climate change.
Thank you, Ms. Flowers. I couldn't agree more with you. I think that it is critical to continue to talk about this topic. That's why this hearing is so important. There's nothing more important, I don't think, to any of us than clean drinking water, access to clean water, even for our coastal communities, so that our children's health is protected. I have a quick question now for Ms. Heeps. You mentioned, I'm curious, you mentioned the right to water law that was enacted in California. Can you just briefly comment on what that entails and how that's worked for California? I'm curious to see if that's something that we can do in Florida as well.
Sorry. I'm happy. I see we're almost out of time, so I'm happy to actually put something in writing so I can address it better. But it basically provides guidance for implementation of that human right to water across state agencies that deal with water, and also provides guidance for local utilities as they are making decisions.
Okay, and just lastly, if I am allowed, I would like to ask for unanimous consent to include in today's hearing record an article from Bloomberg Business Week. Miami will be underwater soon. Its drinking water could go first. Without objection, so ordered. Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Graves for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today and appreciate your testimony. Mayor, First, it really is impressive to see some of the cost savings and some of the forward-leaning efforts that you took working together with EPA on integrated planning. And so first, I want to commend you. I want to commend you for the cost savings. I want to commend you for thinking forward and working through a voluntary relationship with EPA on an integrated planning approach that apparently yield good outcomes for your community, and I have family there, so that's important. But I'm curious, as you may know, we did enact integrated planning law last year, and I believe you may have some thoughts about what we got right and maybe what we've left out and can improve on in a second generation bill. Do you care to share any perspective on that?
Absolutely. Like I shared in my opening comments, integrating planning was literally just a thought, and we acted on a memo. I still have the memo that came at the time from Nancy Stoner. And so as you look at the integrated planning and the way it was passed, thank you for doing that. We're very happy at the U.S. Conference of Mayors that became law. There's a couple pieces as we look at integrated planning going forward, and that is, and especially across this country, in order to meet the regulatory requirements, EPA has, I believe, 5 different ways that you can meet those standards, and one is a variance. Believe it or not, that's not universally done across the United States. The state of Washington, my understanding, has never done a variance to meet in my opinion, unreasonable requirement of, in this case, 7 parts per quadrillion of PCBs. We can't even measure that. And so as we look at this in an integrated planning, you really need to go back and look at the regulatory framework after those plans are accepted. If those plans are accepted as the right way to do, and again, this wasn't without green infrastructure, but that is to be said, how does then the regulatory environment meet with the integrated planning? So I would ask, especially this committee and their oversight at the EPA and of the delegated states, that it's actually implemented the way it was intended. So I was very excited to hear the chairwoman talk about the oversight role of this committee.
Great, thank you. I appreciate it, and as we move forward, again, I fully expect that through oversight and through perhaps a second generation bill, version 2, we'll come back. And so if you do have any additional thoughts, I'd appreciate you sharing those with us on how we can further improve or build upon.
Integrated funding would be another key issue.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Creek, I want to commend you for some of the efforts that you've undertaken. It appears some of the cost savings you have provided under some of the work that you've done has been impressive. Could you talk a little bit about how replicable you think that is? Because there is, as you've heard from the panel, there's sort of mixed messages about whether this is a funding issue, an implementation issue, and I'm just curious of your perspective on how replicable it is and how we could do a better job from here helping to empower other communities to achieve some of the low rates that you've been able to achieve.
Thank you, Congressman. I think, well, in a way, our county is sort of a microcosm of the whole country in that we have this very economically distressed community with average median income of only $26,000, and yet we have some affluent communities as well. So I believe that it's completely replicable for any utility. The key is if the state revolving fund is there. Without the state revolving fund, we could not have done it. We would have had to raise rates, and we would have been forced to raise rates for, because we would have had to raise rates on our economic distressed communities. So that would have been a real problem. But because of the state revolving fund and because of internal efficiencies, we were able to upgrade our infrastructure as it needed to be, but also hold the rate. And I definitely believe it's replicable. I think, though, for some utilities or municipalities which lack resources, whether it be economic distressed communities, cities, rural areas, I think that's where a peer-to-peer effort, especially from the state revolving fund, maybe getting, almost like circuit riders getting out there to help them with the state revolving fund, because what I found in Camden was that they lacked resources to apply for the funding. And the funding was available for them, so they had to get much higher interest rates when they could afford it because they didn't have the funding to go through the SRF program. So one thing I'd really recommend is support for economic distressed communities, smaller, rural, urban areas that don't have the internal capacity to apply for these fundings. So 2 things. 1, make the funding available, continue to make it, expand it as much as possible. It is a loan that has to be paid back, but then also provide some assistance for those that need it to apply for it and go through the program.
Great. Thank you. I'm out of time. Ms. Taylor, I wanted to ask you a question. All I could think about when I heard you talking about the money issue, that quote that people who say money can't buy you happiness don't know where to shop. But I do have some follow-up questions with you, and we'll submit those in writing if you don't mind responding. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, sir, for your testimony. Mr. Delgado, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I want to thank the panel, and of course, especially thank Mr. Hiskey for making the trip from upstate to tell the folks here in D.C. about the needs of rural communities. 11 counties, that's how many counties are in New York 19. I represent the third most rural district of any Democrat in this body, the eighth, both Republicans and Democrats. As you've articulated, Greenport is one of the many communities in New York 19 where residents are not only struggling to pay their water bills due to increasing rates, but also have seen an increase in property taxes to pay for vital infrastructure projects. It is for this reason that I'm glad to support the Water Act, which creates a water trust fund to be used by the Clean and Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Funds. Legislation would also create a new grant program to help rural communities improve their water and sewer systems. Now, you've talked about technical assistance for small and rural communities and how important it is to help with complying with the Clean Water Act and assessing the state's revolving funds. Can you explain how this works specifically, and how has Greenport, I know you've talked about a little bit of this earlier with the $75,000 grant, has benefited from technical assistance?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we work with rural water quite a bit. They've helped us with our clean water, our revolving fund loans. They've helped us with contacts with people. They've helped guide us on how to pursue this. We're a small rural community. We don't have anyone on staff who does this. We either have to hire an engineer or we have to go to someone like Rural Water to help guide us through it. And we have a lot of the same problems that the large communities do, where you do have to go to a number of different funding sources and see if you can get funding in order to be able to do your projects. And without the money from the revolving loan fund, we could not do a lot of these projects. We just simply couldn't afford them. With the American Resource and Recovery Act money that we received with our wastewater plant, we were under consent order. We were looking at a $9.5 million bill. If we had self-financed it, we would have spent $17 million over the 30 years of the loan. We were fortunate. We were going to end up spending roughly around $4 million for that same plant, which made it something that our community was able to afford. We would not have been able to afford it without that help. We were very fortunate to get a zero-interest loan. We were extremely fortunate to get half loan forgiveness. That also allowed us to turn around and do another water project afterwards that badly needed to be done. We had 50 water breaks a year. That work needed to be done. There's no way we would have been able to do both. It just would have been impossible for our community. We can't afford it. We still have a lot of work left to do. We need to upgrade our pump system. We need to upgrade our transmission system. There's a lot of money still left on the table, and hopefully with the SRF money, we'll be able to do that. We have been raising rates. We've been trying to keep them from getting too extreme because our residents just can't afford it. We have a lot of seniors. We used to have a lot of industry in our area.
Yes.
And that's basically what paid for most of the infrastructure to go in the first place, but most of that is gone now.
Right.
And the businesses that we do have are not the type that really participate in the community in the same way that the industry and the factories that were there before used to participate. It's a lot of retail, a lot of small stores, but they don't have the kind of resources and funds to support the infrastructure like some of the larger businesses that we had in the past did. So,
yeah, and I appreciate all of that. And to follow up, piggyback on a comment or a question from one of my colleagues earlier on the distinction between public and private action and the role that some might believe private actors are better suited to in terms of, or suited for in terms of addressing these scenarios. And I have often found that absent a population center, a dense population center that can function as a basis for achieving profit in some way, shape, or form, rural communities are marginalized as a result because private actors don't have the incentive to invest in these communities, and one would therefore hope that in promoting the general welfare and promoting the public good, as is our responsibility as detailed in the Constitution, that the government would at that point deem it appropriate to leave no one behind. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, sir. Mr. Palmer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mayor Condon, a lot of states and localities are using life cycle cost analysis to determine the appropriate materials for a particular project. Given the limited resources that, particularly of municipalities, would more frequent use of a life cycle analysis help these funds go farther?
Yes, definitely, and that's the approach we took as we went to integration across our city. We now, like I spoke earlier in my graphic number 2 there, we now look at our streets as part of that life cycle costs, i.e., we used to go in and look at, and especially since they were all stovepipe, just like most governments, stormwater, wastewater, and water all had different motivations. Now they want to retain less stormwater. In some cases, in some sections of our streets that we went to redo, saves nearly $1 million from treatment by redesigning the streets to take into account stormwater collection. What I always say is old is new again. We used to have parking strips. We got rid of those in the 70s and 80s. We're now back to those. We call them swales. Yeah. But at the end of the day, especially in my part of the country, that's where the snow goes and that's where the stormwater goes. So definitely life cycle is key.
You said something in your testimony that caught my attention. This is an issue that's been brought up in other committees that I've served on, and that is the regulatory standards that are being imposed. Sometimes the technology doesn't exist to achieve those, and plus, even if you do a life cycle analysis and you get what you think is more than adequate, the standards change so rapidly that even before you've fully paid for what you just did, you're having to do it over.
That's exactly our request for a variance that my citizens are paying $200 million in green bonds for the next 17 years. That was a 20-year bond cycle, which is quite conservative in this country as we're going to 30, 40, 50-year bonds. But our citizens should, as they mortgage this green infrastructure, have the benefit at least on that contaminant. And if I could finish, most of our regulatory environment is on quantity, not quality. If we were truly to look at the quality of our river, our citizens, very environmentally minded, would use their resources for other contaminants rather than going after the first one on the list that we've done a major investment on, but now the standard had moved on us in the middle from the start of integrated planning to the end of integrated planning when I'm supposed to sign a permit before the end of the year. Now they're saying that went from 170 parts per quadrillion now down to 7. So what am I supposed to do as we finish one of the most innovative projects in the country, and now the regulation shifted on me?
Well, what they've done is they've created regulations, and they say that it's black box technology. Well, there's nothing in the box, and it's putting an enormous burden on cities. Particularly, I grew up in rural Northwest Alabama, and it has potential to bankrupt cities. Mr. Witkowski, you mentioned the consent order that you're under. I represent most of Jefferson County, and that was the largest municipal bankruptcy in the history of the country until Detroit. And that began with a consent decree dealing with our storm sewers. And I know that's not the subject of this hearing, but I've done a tremendous amount of work on this about creating a database transparency, and I'm proud to say that every Democrat, all of my Democrat colleagues voted for this to bring transparency to this issue so that when someone gets elected mayor or governor or city council, they know what they're under and have an opportunity to have some kind of mitigation for that. You didn't elaborate on it, but what you're really saying is that you've lost control of the ability to correct the situation because it's under the control of a federal judge or a control group or a special master.
Well, yes, I mean, you have a plan for how you want to proceed with your problems, and suddenly all of the money gets shifted to a separate problem because of the consent order. It is work that needs to be done, but it also impacts all the rest of the infrastructure that you have to take care of. You know, in the small rural communities, we don't have a lot of resources to help us. It's usually just a few guys. And, you know, you're not only dealing with wastewater and water, you're dealing with stormwater, you're dealing with parks, you're dealing with streets, you're dealing with everything together. And when you get a consent order and so much money and focus has to go to that consent order, all of the other utilities suffer for it. And unfortunately, we don't have the resources to combine everything and do everything at once, and we don't have the people to go out and look for these grants, look for these loans, and pursue that. We need to get help from outside in order to be able to do that.
I thank the witnesses for their attendance today, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, sir. Ms. Craig, you are recognized.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman. As you know, each of you, non-point source water pollution is a big problem across the country. It comes from multiple sources, and unlike point source pollution, that can be traced back to industrial and sewage treatment plants. Under EPA's 319 program, states receive grants to help develop and administer their own programs to address non-point source pollution. As each of you may know, I have worked with my Republican colleague, Representative Brian Mast of Florida, and we've introduced a bill that would reauthorize this program for the first time since it was established. So I'd like to start with perhaps Mr. Kryken and perhaps Professor Heeps and ask you, how important is it for Congress to continue to reauthorize and appropriate funds for this program, and tell me how it can address these non-point sources of pollution.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, I mean, it is incredibly important. Thank you to you and to your Republican colleagues and others who are supporting this bill. The 319H grant program is a very important funding program. We've been talking about the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, and that really is helpful. But 319H is a program that offers assistance for things that aren't eligible for the State Revolving Fund program. So we've been using 319H funding in Camden County for a lot of that green infrastructure, some of it that didn't have a combined sewer nexus, like building like bioswales along riverfronts, brownfield cleanups, et cetera, things that didn't necessarily weren't related to our sewer system itself. So it's a great supplement and assistance for even in an urban area, but especially in rural areas. So I really support it and hope that it goes forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to echo what Mr. Kryken said. In the Chesapeake Bay watershed, there's been a phenomenal cooperation between federal, state, local governments to try to clean up the Chesapeake Bay, but stormwater is the one area of pollution that continues to grow, and 319 grants are critical to address those. In rural Vermont, agricultural pollution is a problem, and 319 grants are used to help farmers put in important conservation practices to reduce their runoff pollution as well.
Thank you so much. Mrs. Flowers, I just want to start this next question to you, but I want to first say that thank you for your work with EJI. I had the opportunity to visit your state and your city here this past weekend with Congressman John Lewis and walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with him in Selma. So it was stunning, frankly. I come from a suburban, half rural district in Minnesota, where we haven't been investing in certain things, and to see the inequities and disparities in your community, every American should see that, and I think it would make such an incredible difference. So, Ms. Flowers, in your testimony, you noted that the U.S. Census once captured information regarding whether homeowners were served by municipal treatment or septic systems, but the question was taken off after the 1990 census. Can you speak a little more to what kind of data that collection would be useful to properly assess the wastewater infrastructure needs in the country?
Well, I think, thank you for asking that question, and thank you for coming to the area this weekend. That information, we can't solve the problem without understanding and quantifying what the problem is. And I actually, one of the observations that I've made since I've been working in rural communities is that after the census stopped going from door to door, I think a lot of rural communities were left out. You cannot do a qualitative analysis of people in rural communities by just looking at addresses. Because for an example, in Lowndes County, there may be one address and 5 homes there, but that's not going to be counted. And whenever funds are distributed or help is or they design projects, they look at that kind of data, and I think that data, there are gaps that are missing in rural communities. We have what we call a rural lexicon. And with that rural lexicon, it means that a lot of the policies are written in such a way that excludes rural communities. For an example, if it says it's a municipality of so many people, that automatically excludes a whole lot of rural communities. So we think that in terms of the census, the data that could be collected by finding out how many people are on rural wastewater systems or septic systems will help us work on the solution a lot better. Because I think right now when people look at it, because we're in the news, they think if they solve the problem in Lowndes County, Alabama, it's solved in America. That's not true.
Thank you so much, and I yield the balance of my time, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, Ms. Craig, and now we'll yield to my co-chair for the rest of the questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And now I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you both. My part of Northern California is the area that includes what's known as the Camp Fire in what was Paradise, California, as well as many other fires. You had the Carr Fire in Redding, California, as well. The damages that are being attributed to the Camp Fire are being estimated at $16.5 billion at this point, which would be the largest disaster anywhere in 2018 in terms of cost. 19,000 structures, 14,000 of them being homes. Residents trying to determine if they're going to come back to the area. There's a good cleanup phase going on right now, and things are going reasonably well in that regard. But the intention is to rebuild the town, and many of us are committed to seeing that done. But we need an improvement in the process there. It's one of the largest towns anywhere that was nearly entirely on a septic system, and we know what kind of problems there is with compliance and all that, and so it needs to come back with a good sewer system on that, especially for the main spine area of the town and branching out where it's practical. So the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and other wastewater upgrade grants all require a local match. So I guess my question, I'll ask Mr. Condon and Mr. Moczicki on what they think about this. The local match for a place where basically not very many people live right now, the population of about 30,000 is decimated. You may have a few hundred living in the town, and it'll take a while to rebuild that. But should we rebuild the same old infrastructure? Should we improve at this time when you have, unfortunately, but indeed I guess there's opportunity to rebuild with better infrastructure, where they're talking, underground on the power lines, but indeed coming back with a sewer system, you've got it torn up, you might as well do it right. Outside of asking FEMA for additional money, what can be done for a community that has been devastated like this, since they don't presently have the tax base to do so right now? So you two gentlemen, please.
Well, I'll start. Of course, we're a larger city, but of course we're in the middle of rural America in eastern Washington, northern Idaho area. And it is becoming more and more this way, that the federal and state government requires the matching funds, which is very difficult. I alluded earlier, I come from the 5th Congressional District, represented by Congresswoman McMorris Rodgers, but formerly by Speaker Foley. And at that time, there was $100 million, $5 million a year to eliminate our septic tanks in the region, because we're on a single source aquifer. That was a grant, and so that went over a 20-year period. We had an innovative program in the region to deal with that. So as you look at these programs, it really gets back to, especially for the smaller communities, grants, low interest loans, but as soon as you start putting in the match requirements, it becomes much more difficult, to say the least, especially since there is multiple sources that we usually have to go after to get these dollars. So where does the match count? and whose match counts where and what percentage of that match, and it becomes even a more bureaucratic Rubik's Cube to put these funding sources together, so it becomes even more difficult for the smaller communities, definitely. So the more you can simplify it, the more you can look at a single source for integrated projects. Someone, as they go to rebuild an entire town, where is the dollars that come from many different sources, but you only have to apply to a single grant account at the federal level or at the state level, rather than making these communities go across multiple different funding sources.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I mean, the other thing is that, obviously your situation is a particularly difficult situation. And there needs to be something in the program that allows for these difficult situations. It makes sense to do these projects now. It'll be much more cost-effective to do it now. And, the money should be set aside so that it does help the people that are most in need. And I would think that this situation should be something that should qualify for it.
I'm sure if, the population was there, they'd be willing to have that discussion on how to come up with a match. But we need something unique in this and other disaster situations. So what kind of regulatory changes can we make to reduce the cost of delivering these systems, since the projected need over the coming next 20 years is almost triple of what's been invested in the last 50 years? So would you touch on that, please, Mr. Witkowski?
Well, I think one of the biggest things for the, as far as regulatory, is to, rather than have the entities try to use enforcement to force people to do upgrades without having any sort of financing to back that up, or some help for the local communities to do it, to try to use the best technologies out there and try to fund that and make improvements, not necessarily just solve a problem, but try to solve the problem long term. We want to try to make permanent solutions, not just get out from underneath an enforcement. We want something that's going to last, something that's going to be long-term, something that we don't have to come back and redo. So the funding needs to be adequate to allow communities to be able to fix their problem and put something in that's going to last.
Modernize it, but at the same time, we have to be cost-effective in doing that. I hope there's less roadblocks and unneeded costs and hurdles. So I'll better yield back. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Lowenthal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I have two sets of questions. One has to do with the NPDES permitting process, and the other one about what I believe is the critical need for to capitalize the state revolving fund, and I'm going to ask about that. But the first one is, about a year ago, maybe a little less, Congress, after a hearing in this subcommittee, Congressman Garamendi and myself wrote a letter to the committee saying that we wanted to follow up that hearing on the need to modernize the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permitting process, the NPDES permitting process, by allowing states with who have the delegated authority to administer the permitting process to issue permits for up to 10 years rather than just 5 years. And it gets to what Mr. Woodall said. It would not be a mandatory, we did not request mandatory moving it up, but that we reward good actors, really, and those that are trying to comply by actually allowing them to do the work that they need to do. So I'm wondering first from the mayor, Mayor Condon, and also I think Mr. Grickham. What's your experience? How important, is this a good step? Should this committee really be working on something like that, setting in legislation so that those actors who are good actors have an opportunity to extend it? And how important is that to extend it? So I ask you.
In 2 words, very important. To give certainty to our ratepayers, to give certainty to local governments to implement these regulations. I use the example in our case where we have We have prudently bonded some $200 million of a $350 million project. There's 17 years left in that payment. For that, for that regulation, now mind it, one of only hundreds, if not thousands, of regulations on this issue, we should be granted a variance to the best science that was available, the best equipment that is available, that down payment by my community has been made. And so how do we then go through the permit process to give that security to our citizens? Technology is phenomenal. And we spend inordinate amounts of money getting to the best technology. The good actors should be rewarded with that. And so the movement to 10 years it would be phenomenal, or the technology or the investment that was been made. I'd further that with and encourage this committee in your oversight through that it's universally applied across the country, especially in delegated states. My state has never had a variance based on the regulations created, both here in Congress and then also those that are at the agency level. That there is, and I can't say this enough, that the good actors get rewarded even in the case where there are delegated states. And although I believe in the states' rights and that ability, but also a real reality of what's happening across this country.
Thank you, Congressman. First of all, I applaud you and your colleagues for the thoughtful way of looking at this NPDES permit situation. To me, I think that the length of the permit cycle is not as critical as the ability to be able to modify the permit should technology or external conditions change. That is really, if there is less rigidity, then the permit duration doesn't really matter. My concern about, as an environmentalist as well as a water utility manager, is that good actors and bad actors are sometimes determined by the leadership, and so it's not. So utilities aren't monolithic, and so you might have a good actor, but then the leadership might change, and it might not be a good actor, and so you have to be careful, I think, about that. But I think that there needs to be flexibility within the permitting system to, for example, blending is a really good example of that. You know, we could actually, if our permit was more flexible, we could actually take more stormwater flow at our treatment plant and reduce combined sewage flooding and overflows if we were allowed to mix the flow, the flow in a different way, and it's more of a permit rigidity, which is hard to explain in a short time. But the point is I think greater flexibility is the thing that really the good actors need, and that would be my recommendation, sir.
Yeah, just quickly, Mr. Crickham, you know, in your testimony earlier, I think you know how the SRF loans allowed your agency to keep water rates down. Can you expand? How does it affect affordability? I know Orange County, we've used it a tremendous amount. It's been extremely successful in our groundwater replenishment system. But tell me, how does it, and I know it's very briefly, just a few seconds.
Basically, the state revolving fund allows us to upgrade the equipment in a way so that the new equipment has lower maintenance costs, lower energy costs because it's newer, so the operations and maintenance savings are greater than the annual debt service cost because of the low interest rates. That's how we're able to upgrade the performance, protect the environment and the public health, and hold the rates down.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Puerto Rico, Ms. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity, all the members of the panel. And I think I will go in the same line Mr. Lamalfa, my friend from California, just made because of the disasters in California. And I thank for taking the opportunity to explain what happened with Hurricane Sandy. And we in Puerto Rico, I'm the only representative for the 3.2 million American citizens living there. And one thing is before the hurricane and another one after the hurricane. In our case, we are dealing with different situations as well. We do have an oversight board on the island that limits and actually just capped to 50% the capital investments in infrastructure for the next 6 years. And when we identify, and the government of Puerto Rico identify more than $769 million needed just to repair the water infrastructure in the island, and now that is capped to just $13 million $13 million every year for 6 years, we will never recover from that. So we got different experiences that I wanna ask for your advice here. One thing is the money that we receive from FEMA in order to repair a lot of these water systems. The other one is that we are also under the pressure of restructuring the debt of the island, and that limits our opportunities to actually access a lot of the funds and matching the requirements for the communities. We got more than 170 community separate water systems that attends more than 89,000 people on the island as well. The main issue is right now that, as Lamalfa was talking about, we may have been allocated the money by this Congress and President to fix a lot of the failures or infrastructure damaged by the hurricane. And actually, this committee recommended to pass an amendment that I was pushing for, the Stafford Act, in order to build back better, not the way it was before. But right now, we got a normative or a memo from FEMA saying that will cost more money immediately, and that will just fix what was there before the hurricane. And that was not the intention of the law. So my question for the panel here and the mayors as well is, how do we find a balance to build back better, because the community need it, in terms of the access to not just drinking water. Actually, we are in a drought right now, so there's water restrictions in Puerto Rico in some areas as we speak today, because there's a lot of investment that need to be done, and we just paid our debt with the revolving systems just in February 20. So we are showing the real need of getting more access to that money. How do we make changes, or how this Congress can directly make changes in order to communities to match that 20%, connecting the FEMA when disasters are happening, even by another law of Congress, in our case, the Oversight Board, to make that infrastructure better. I think the whole point of this hearing is how we can get our better infrastructure in water services, clean water, and wastewater as well. So any recommendations would be highly appreciated.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. I've spoken with Pete Lopez, the EPA Regional Administrator, because New Jersey and Puerto Rico are in the same region, along with New York, and our wastewater treatment plant is almost exactly the same size as PRASA's largest treatment plant. So he asked me to speak with PRASA, because what we're doing to get off the grid and develop a microgrid for Camden City's most vulnerable facilities like hospitals, drinking water plant, fire, police, schools, the jail, et cetera, could be replicated in Puerto Rico. And it could be done in a way, in fact, I think it could be done more effectively because of the water energy nexus. There's an even greater opportunity in Puerto Rico because of your high energy costs. So I've been talking with PRASA, and I'd be glad to speak with you afterward about it. I think there's a tremendous opportunity to do a project that would take your water, turn it into your sewage and sludge, and turn it into energy, underground resilient energy, which then could be used to protect the island against power outages from storms like last summer. I think there's a tremendous opportunity there. Also, food waste conversion into energy. And it's definitely affordable, and the energy savings would pay for the facility costs. I've already looked at it.
I know I'm running out of time, but if we can met or even have written recommendations, I will be more than welcome to have it. And we never talk here about generators. 6 months after the hurricane, we were drinking water because we used generators in our power plants, and we still do it in some areas. So thank you, and I yield back.
Reclaiming my time, thank you, Mr. Westerman. He has to depart. The next witness, Mr. Carvajal is on.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of you for being here and sharing your testimony with us. Mr. Criken, thank you for your willingness to advocate in support of much-needed water and wastewater infrastructure resources for local government. I served in local government for many years, so I really appreciate you more than ever today. In your testimony, you mentioned Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey and hurricanes in Houston, Florida, and Puerto Rico. You use these examples as evidence of how ill-equipped our existing water infrastructure is to deal with these extreme events in climate change. I represent the Central Coast of California. Last winter, our region experienced a devastating wildfire season, followed by a very, very heavy rainfall event, which triggered a deadly debris flow that claimed the lives of 23 of my constituents and ruptured the main water line in Montecito. This left many in my community stranded and without access to clean drinking water for days. Based on your experience in local government, what are the pros and cons of creating a dedicated federal program to help communities strengthen the resiliency of their water and wastewater infrastructure against these threats, one, and two, what are the challenges that local governments experience in trying to fund some of these water resiliency projects?
Thank you, Congressman. I mean, for the first question, it's an absolute must. I mean, we've already seen, I know there's a difference of opinion between whether climate change is real or not. Set that aside, climate history has shown that our infrastructure, as it is now, is wholly inadequate for how the climate is now. So we must build resiliency. And then there is quite a bit of body of science that shows that the climate will only worsen and that problem will only be exacerbated. So I think it's critical to have resiliency funding for vulnerable communities, both in arid communities or in areas where there's too much water. And I couldn't support that more and hope that the Congress will support that. In the meantime, we must look for opportunities. If you're in an area where there's too much water, like in the east, where we have flooding issues, or in Puerto Rico or Florida, Houston, we need to upgrade our infrastructure. We need to expand it. We need to build for rising river level issues. We need green infrastructure is very important, and that should be funded. Our state does fund it, but not all states do. They fund it through the SRF to soak up the stormwater. In arid states, there are measures that need to be taken as well. I mean, I think that we're doing the future of our country and our children and grandchildren a disservice if we don't plan for this now and try to fund to protect the vulnerable communities in our country.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carvajal. Seeing as there are no other questions from the members of Congress, we will go to a second round, if you don't mind. This is a very important issue. We want to give it as much light as we can. So I will start with a question from Mayor Condon. One of the things that you mentioned was the integrated integration of your streets to collect more water. Would you mind elaborating on that? I think that is an important thing for us to know, and some of my cities are doing it, but I would like to know more about it.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Yes, several years ago we took this integrated idea and took it throughout our city. We now look at our streets as three-dimensional, as what's important underneath is just as important as what's on top. And we functionally went through the process of handing our streets department from the operational government over to the utility side of our operation, meaning that those same engineers that design our water, sewer, stormwater system now design our streets. We used to have that all done separately. Not only that, but you can think of it, and those of us in local government, we get notified when they see a brand new street a year or two later, the utility division is out there cutting it open to put in new water mains or new sewer mains. We now, it took us 3 years in transition, but now a lot of our street redos are done based off of what the infrastructure underneath needs to be done, saving all the money from reconstructing that street after utility. Not only that, but now our investor-owned utilities are lining up their capital projects with ours so that they're redoing their capital at the same time.
Well, I'm glad to know that because at one point I had asked when I was mayor of a city why the utilities didn't inform us when they were going to break the streets up. Guys, we could channel all that energy and save money and do it right. But now that it's happening, maybe more people will take notice of that. Thank you very much for the answer. Mayor Witkowski, the Clean Water Act once authorized grants for water infrastructure, but switched primarily to loans through the Clean Water SRF. You suggest that SRFs should be allowed to use grants in form of loan forgiveness and zero interest. I agree with that. Can you expand upon the point?
Well, yes. Well, all I know is that for us, if we did not have the loan forgiveness and the 0% interest, we would not have been able to construct a plant that would have completely solved our problem as far as discharging wastewater to the local creeks. So it's very important, especially for the small rural communities. They just don't have the resources to fund adequately what they need to do in order to solve the problem long term. What we're looking to do is, we need the zero interest loans. We need these grants to be in place for the most vulnerable communities. I mean, we were fortunate to get that money, and it allowed us to do some of the other work that we needed to do with our water lines. More to the point, we had the same problem with our highway department, and our water and sewer utilities are separate, and there's nothing more disturbing to a highway superintendent than going out and watching us put a nice big hole in a brand new paved road because the water lines are so inadequate and they fail so often, but they just couldn't wait to repave the road, and a week later, 2 weeks later, you're out there digging these roads up. Stuff does need to be coordinated, but we also need to be able to afford it, and without the Clean Water Act funds and without the grants and the zero interest loans, there's just no way these small communities can afford it.
Thank you for your testimony. Let's see, Mr. Kraken, you suggest that the SRS is a proven successful resource for water utilities to replace and upgrade the infrastructure while keeping the rates affordable. Please expand upon that point.
Thank you, Congresswoman and Chairman. So we have used the state revolving fund since its inception in 1987 and borrowed in about over $1 billion in funding and paid, and much of it's been paid back, still borrowing more. We've rebuilt our entire wastewater treatment plant, upgraded Camden City's combined sewer system to the extent that we'll be able to eliminate combined sewage flooding, the same kind of flooding that Ms. Flowers talked about. We'll be able to eliminate that in Camden for up to the 1-inch storm by the end of 2020, plus using that as SRF funding to be off the grid and less vulnerable to power outages, all without raising rates. Our rate was only $337 in 1996 per household per year. It's $352 today. So in 23 years, it's only gone up by $15 a year because of the SRF. So that is proof that the SRF works. We're paying the loans back, but because of the loans, we were able to upgrade our system without raising the rates. And like I said before, Camden City has a median income of $26,000. They can't afford rates, but yet they deserve clean water and they deserve freedom from sewage in their basements. So that's how the SRF works.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lynch, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate you holding, and the ranking member, appreciate holding this hearing on a very important issue. And I want to thank the witnesses. You've been very, very helpful in developing our response. I represent a district in Massachusetts on the Atlantic coast that stretches from the city of Boston, one of the oldest cities in the United States, down to Quincy and Weymouth, down all the way down the South Shore to towns like Cohasset and Situate and Hull that are impacted regularly by climate change, and there are also some infrastructure issues on their water supplies because of the age of those systems. And it is heartening to hear the concern and the commitment to the state revolving funds. We've done quite a bit of work in Massachusetts. We funded the Deer Island Water Sewage Treatment Facility. Up until that point, since the days of Massachusetts Bay Colony, they were basically flushing their wastewater out into Boston Harbor. And so that has dramatically changed. Now, a couple of years ago at Easter Sunrise Service, we have it at Castle Island in South Boston. It's a beautiful area overlooking the harbor. And if there wasn't 900 people there, no one would believe it, but we actually saw a small school of harbor dolphin going, just offshore. And that's the clearest sign that we've ever seen. That's never in my lifetime has that been the case. But So it shows you how clean that water is getting because of the investment. It largely has been a state and local, municipal investment, though. And so, we've got some of the highest water rates in the country. Maybe because we've been doing the wrong thing for so long, but the investment on the federal side is so important to us. And that has been reflected in all of your testimonies, Ms. Taylor. You've hit the nail on the head. If we invest in this, do it the right way, and we got ratepayers out there. It's not like some aspects of our committee, T&I, because of the public mission, they'll never make money. But this can pay for itself. If we get some help, some very, very low interest funding, bonding, we can pay this over time. But we are dreadfully behind schedule on some of these improvements, and Congress has to take note of this. We can't leave this for the next generation. This is something that's happened on our watch, and I really appreciate the Mayor of Spokane coming here, and because you're dealing with it right at ground zero, and it's real to our mayors, and that's who I'm hearing from. I have meetings with the EPA and others with my mayors to try to resolve this city by city and town by town. So we could sure use your help. And Madam Chair, I'm glad that you have been such a champion on this as well. And I know it's your passion is shared by Chairman DeFazio, and that I think we're in a good place, Republican and Democrat, on this committee and in Congress, about the importance of providing that support for our water systems and critical infrastructure. So very happy to hear your perspectives. I think it's very important that you came here today and shared those visions with us. And I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Finch. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I like the way I quickly rose ranks here today. I will go back to the question I was doing before, and I know we never got enough time to answer. So, Mayor Condon, can you talk about what other measures can be taken in order to rebuild not the way it was before, but in a better way? And I will combine that question with, I was looking into your ALICE formula, and I would like to know, how do you deal with people that are under the poverty level line? Because in Puerto Rico, the household medium income annually is $19,000. So our poverty level rose to 43%, which is higher than even Mississippi. So how do you manage that, and how do you apply using a lower income from communities as well?
Quickly, I wrote down your Build Back Better. I like that alliteration. So first of all, ALICE is done across the country, every community, and so it's eye-opening when you really see that budget, what it means. And there's been comments about, your base rate versus your utilization rate, especially on the water side. I was elected primarily because of water rates going up double digits on the consumption side. I do give some credence to the idea that the base rates, if they go too high, people can't negate that. I would also suggest, though, if it's, in our case, so overtly on the utilization side, imagine who is using more water. Those people that can't afford brand new, to be honest with you, things like toilets, brand new appliances that use dramatically less water. And so your families, your senior citizens, your low income inadvertently use more water. Those growing their own food at their house. Some of my areas that voted for me because of that water rate increase are senior citizens that have large gardens. So they're doing exactly what we want, reducing food deserts, using natural foods. So when you go to water consumption only rates, it also causes a problem. And so as we go down this path, I would suggest that we look at that. It's a whole picture. The second is, and I'll go back to it again, is the idea, especially as you build back an entire community, is to look across the federal agencies and look at opportunities where those dollars can be utilized together. but not necessarily put that burden on the localities to figure out where in federal government that they can get dollars, but rather look across the federal government and truly authorize an account that is for integrated projects from streets to utilities. This is basic infrastructure, and done together, our private sector and our public sector will do the right thing. Now we have, Chairwoman, as a mayor, you probably saw this. We have people coming together in city government that said, you know what, if I have authority over the entire right-of-way, look what I can do. And my citizens are getting walking paths they never got before. They are getting permeable pavement trails, and that all removes stormwater from the system, rewarding our stormwater utility because it's not coming into the treatment plant. The previous plan was a total gray solution, spend millions, hundreds of millions on the sewage treatment plant. Now we didn't have to spend as much because less in does not need to be then treated. And so really looking at integrated solutions, but for the federal government to reward that with, yes, funding for integrated projects and also permits that allow this sort of innovative thinking.
Is there any, when you're using new technology, is there any legal barrier to improvise or improve, I may say, the technology uses in water systems?
Not that I'm aware. I'll ask our experts, and I can submit that for your testimony. One of the more recent ones we're using now is satellite imagery for leakage, where rather than literally today, there's a truck that goes out in Spokane, some 60 square miles of a city, and they listen to the street for water, and that's the current technology. They have a picture of me listening to the street. It never popped up on social media, but a giant stethoscope because they listen for certain sound waves. Now the technology we're literally just testing out, one of the first in the country, is using satellite imagery to look at leakages. So phenomenal possibilities in technology.
Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. One more question I have for Ms. Flowers. One of the things that we talk about is the pollution of our water. And we haven't even scratched the surface on industrial, farm runoff, and drugs, opioids. But essentially, we got to deal with the first problem we have. It's dealing with delivery of water, clean water, potable water to residents. What would you ask us to do?
Well, I think the burden, we just partnered with the Alabama Rivers Alliance. And we partnered because they have found, at least on the state level, where the big polluters are getting away with polluting the rivers and the streams. And as I mentioned in my testimony, homeowners were being criminalized for having failing septic systems and no septic systems at all. So I think one of the ways in which we could deal with that is to try to find a way to fund or get funds to those small areas that don't have access to the finances to put technologies in place to treat wastewater. In our area, I know everybody's talked about the match that's required. There's no tax base, and so therefore there's no match, and they won't be able to apply and receive funding. So there should be something that would allow for those parts of America that have been marginalized for so long to be prioritized where they can have access to these funds as well, because to make them available and then people don't have access to it, it's not going to clean up our rivers and streams. We're going to still have the same problems that we have right now.
Ms. Taylor?
We believe that it is the federal government's responsibility to guarantee access to clean water and sanitation. And given that priority, everything else is about best practices. And I've heard the mayor, my colleagues on this end, I've written 1 million notes. I'm going to take all those things back. The bottom line is that our folks are drinking water that's not clean. In Detroit and Highland Park and other places, we don't even have dirty water to drink. So this is a federal government's responsibility to find a way to make this happen. And I trust with all of these smart people here, we can do this. We can do this.
They need to share best practices.
We can share best practices. I'm prepared to send Uber to pick anybody up and bring you to Detroit so we can talk about this, because we can do this.
We can if we all work together.
Yes.
Ms. Heep.
I would echo what my colleagues up here have already said. We need more. We need polluters to be held accountable. We need resources for communities. Just to answer Mr. Lowenthal's question, I wasn't asked, but I think 10 years on an NPDES permit is a terrible idea. I would have told Mr. Lynch that in Gardner, Massachusetts, the sewage treatment plant there had its permit expire in 2014, and it still doesn't have a new permit yet. So I would say that also Mr. Kreiken mentioned we don't know who the good guys and the bad guys are because we have too much turnover in these organizations. So I would support everything that's been said here and oppose 10-year permit conditions.
Well, thank you very much, panel. You've been very enlightening, and it certainly is a pleasure hearing from people who are affected. It's important for us to have those testimonies in the record. If you, the need for action, the need for more funding, investment is in underserved communities, all of us working together can help address the critical issue of water infrastructure and potable water. In closing, I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I'd like to thank you witnesses again. Thank you very much. I ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. And I understand Ms. Colon has information on Puerto Rico she'd want us to have included in the record. That's correct. So ordered, without objection. I would like to thank again very much. You've been very kind, and it's been a long hearing, but thank you again. If no other members have anything to add, committee stands adjourned.